Erythea, the city of the call of Asmodeus. In the depths of a nation whose features have faded stands a distant city called Erythea, where reality and illusion intertwine, and souls wrestle between despair and hope. Erythea is not just a city, it is a living entity, where every corner whispers untold stories and every street bears witness to conflicts between the past and present, hatred and love, pain and salvation. In this city, echoes of the call of Asmodeus resonate, a call heard only by those who carry in their hearts the absurdity of life and the enigma of destiny. It is a tale of weary souls, some seeking to understand the meaning of their existence, others burning with the fire of vengeance, and others still yearning for love amidst the chaos. In Erythea, nothing is ordinary. Its streets are labyrinths harboring secrets buried by the winds, and its inhabitants carry burdens that cannot be forgotten. Here stands Jack, with his flame burning in the darkness, Mesh walking a fine line between light and shadow, and Anna holding within her a fragile hope that is barely visible. The call of Asmodeus is not just words, it is the reflection of 7 months spent delving into the depths of the human soul, confronting the pain that every person silently bears. It is not a story about heroes or villains, but about humans as they are, with their fears, their love, and their frailty. Erythea is not a city of stone. It is a mirror reflecting what we hide in our depths. Within the folds of this tale, you will find yourself facing endless questions and answers that may never come. Will you heed the call of Asmodeus? And will you dare to enter Erythea? Chapter 1. Shadows of the Old Neighborhood. The sun hesitated to break through the dense clouds draping the city's sky, a city that knew neither peace nor silence. The voices of street vendors mingled with the clamor of old cars, while children played in the narrow alleys with a battered ball, as if trying to escape their reality into a simpler world. In the heart of this bustling neighborhood, a story began to weave itself between Jack and Mesh. Jack, a 12-year-old boy, chased the ball with unrelenting enthusiasm, his eyes gleaming with ambition. Among his friends, he was known for his intelligence and natural leadership, as if something within him always pushed him forward. In the corner of a makeshift playground surrounded by crumbling walls, Mesh sat alone, observing in silence. He seemed younger, quiet as a shadow in the daylight, as if he didn't belong to the chaos around him. His eyes bore a weight far beyond his tender years. With confident steps, Jack approached Mesh, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Hey," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of a sun that refused to shine. "Why don't you join us? We play for fun. There's nothing to lose." Mesh lifted his gaze hesitantly, his voice faint like a passing breeze. "I don't know anyone here, and I don't know how to play." Jack laughed, his laughter brimming with vitality, and patted Mesh on the shoulder. "That doesn't matter. We all started from zero. Come on, you'll learn with us." Mesh hesitated for a moment before a shy smile broke across his face, like the sun rising after a long night. "Okay, I'll try." As Mesh joined the game, his first steps were clumsy, but he began to feel a sense of belonging among Jack and his friends. It was as if they had been waiting for him all along. Gradually, their friendship grew stronger, like the roots of a tree digging deep into the earth, unseen but unshakable. Days passed, solidifying the bond between Jack and Mesh. Mesh remained quiet, speaking little, his eyes carrying endless questions, while Jack was his complete opposite, full of life and energy. Jack led the group, carving out their path and planning the future he envisioned with his bright, sparkling eyes, while Mesh followed silently, finding refuge in Jack's shadow from the harsh world. One day, after their game had ended, the two sat together on the curb, breathing deeply, the day's exhaustion overtaking them. Jack looked out at the horizon, where the sky met the dilapidated buildings, and said with conviction, "When I grow up, I'll become a police officer. I'll bring order back to this chaotic city. I'll stop anyone trying to destroy it." Mesh stared at the ground, tracing invisible lines with his fingers. He replied in a quiet voice, "I don't know what I'll do, but I want to be part of something bigger, something that gives me meaning." Jack placed a firm hand on Mesh's shoulder, his eyes brimming with confidence. "We'll be together, Mesh. You and I will make a difference. We'll change this place." Mesh smiled with that serene smile of his, though beneath it lay something inscrutable, a mystery cloaking his character like an unyielding fog. Yet, in Jack, he found a light that illuminated his darkened path. As time passed, the two grew older, and life began to separate them with invisible threads. Jack joined a military academy, pursuing his dream, while Mesh stayed in the neighborhood, a shadow tethered to its streets. Before Jack left, they met one last time on a hill overlooking the city, the wind swirling around them, carrying the scent of dust and life. With a gaze full of determination, Jack said, "One day, I'll come back and restore order to this city. I'll fight corruption, and I won't let anyone ruin it." Mesh looked out at the city sprawled before them and said in a soft voice, "You're always so full of hope, Jack. I hope things don't change between us, even if everything else does." Jack placed his hand firmly on Mesh's shoulder, as if trying to transfer some of his energy to him. "Nothing will ever change. Even if we're apart, we'll stay friends." Mesh smiled, but it was a smile tinged with profound sadness, as if he knew some things couldn't withstand the tide of time. He said nothing, choosing silence as he always did. Years passed, and Jack achieved his dream. He became a police officer, dedicating his life to his work, drowning in investigations and endless missions. He forgot much of his past, rarely thinking of the old neighborhood or Mesh. He saw himself as a soldier in a never-ending battle against chaos. One evening, as Jack sat in his office filled with papers and reports, Anna, a colleague, entered carrying some files. "We've got a new report from Commander Sam," she said, placing the files in front of him. "Suspicious activity in the eastern part of the city." Jack took the papers, his eyes quickly scanning the information. "Nothing we can't handle. Let's get started." Anna looked at him, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Sometimes I think you live for this job alone." Jack raised his gaze to her, his eyes bearing the weight of years. "Work gives me purpose. If we don't do our duty, who will?" Anna shook her head gently and left to prepare for the upcoming mission, leaving him alone in his office, surrounded by shadows and thoughts that wouldn't let him rest. That night, Jack left the station, the darkness wrapping the city like a heavy shroud. He walked through the streets he knew well, yet they felt foreign, as if they were watching him with different eyes. A weight he couldn't explain pressed on him, as if something from his past was following him. He passed a small, old-fashioned cafe and stopped at its door. He felt a strange urge to go in, as if searching for something. He sat in a corner of the cafe, ordered coffee, and began to observe the place with distant eyes. In another corner, he saw a child sitting alone, his eyes holding the same mystery Jack once saw in Mesh's. Memories of those days flooded back to him, and he wondered where his old friend might be now. Jack quietly paid for the child's meal without the boy noticing. When the child thanked him, his voice felt as though it came from a far-off place, from another time. Jack stepped out of the cafe, the night swallowing the city around him. He felt something missing, an emptiness he couldn't fill with work or success. He wondered if, along the way to fulfilling his dreams, he had lost a part of himself. Chapter 2. A meeting in the shadows of the past. Morning crept in slowly, pale light seeping through the grimy windows of the police station. The air buzzed with activity, phones ringing, overlapping conversations, but Jack felt as if he were in another world. Sitting at his desk, surrounded by files and reports, he was there in body but absent in spirit. "Jack?" Anna's voice pulled him out of his daze. "Are you okay? You look distracted." He looked at her with heavy eyes. "I'm fine. Just a long night." Anna sat across from him, placing some papers on the desk. "We've got a new assignment. Reports of a new gang surfacing in the Western District. Commander Sam wants us to move quickly." Jack nodded, forcing himself to focus. "All right. Assemble the team. We'll start preparations." As Anna left, Jack felt the weight of something familiar pressing down on him. The Western District. A place brimming with memories he had tried to leave behind. An hour later, the team was ready. The vehicles moved silently through the crowded streets, heading toward the Western District. The old buildings, narrow alleys, everything reminded him of the past. When they reached the location, they began their surveillance in silence. Anna monitored the cameras, watching every movement. "Jack, there's activity in the southern alley," she said through the radio. "All right, stay in position." The operation began, everything unfolding as planned. Yet deep down, Jack felt something was off, as if fate itself was pulling at the threads of his life. After a tense confrontation, they succeeded in capturing the gang leader. Anna was the hero of the day, her bravery and brilliance clear to everyone. The following day, she was honored in a modest ceremony at the station. Smiles and congratulations surrounded her, but Jack felt distant, as though watching everything through a pane of glass. "You're proud of her, aren't you?" Commander Sam asked. "Of course. She deserves it." That evening, the team decided to celebrate at their usual cafe. The atmosphere was lively, laughter filling the air, but Jack remained lost in his thoughts. Suddenly, a familiar sound reached his ears. Gentle music, the strumming of an old guitar, and a song carrying the sorrow of the world within its melody. He lifted his gaze toward the small stage and saw him, Mesh, sitting there, playing as if nothing had changed. Time stopped. Everything around him faded. Jack rose slowly, walking toward the stage. Their eyes met, a look passing between them filled with 1,000 questions. "It's been a long time, Jack," Mesh said quietly. "I didn't expect to see you here," Jack replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Places change, but some things remain." They sat together, a heavy silence settling over them. There was so much to say, yet words felt insufficient. "Why did you disappear?" Jack finally asked. Mesh smiled, a mysterious look in his eyes. "I was searching for meaning, for a place in this world." "And you found it here?" "Maybe. Music is all I have left." Jack looked at him and saw the same sadness in his eyes, the same enigma he had never been able to unravel. "I miss those days," Jack said softly. "Time moves on, my friend. We can't bring back the past, but we can remember it." Mesh left him and returned to his playing. Jack sat alone, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. He wondered about the choices he had made and the paths he had taken. That night, Jack realized that some things could never be escaped, and that the past would always haunt him, no matter how far he ran. Chapter 3. The Day of Collapse. The sun was setting slowly, leaving long shadows stretching across the walls of the police department's briefing room. The walls were covered with overlapping maps and scattered intelligence about their targeted gang. The air was charged with tension, not the usual kind, but a subtle foreboding, as though something dreadful was about to unfold. Sam, the police commander, stood before the large map, pointing to an abandoned warehouse that had become a den of crime. "This isn't as simple as it seems," he said in a low voice, as if the words themselves weighed him down. "This gang isn't like the others. They're cornered, with nothing left to lose. They'll be ready to die before surrendering. Jack sat at the front, his eyes fixed on the map, though his mind wandered elsewhere. For him, this operation was more than just another mission. It was a chance to prove himself, to show that order could triumph over chaos. Beside him sat Anna, the new rank on her shoulder feeling heavier than it should. Anna leaned closer, her eyes meeting Jack's. "Are we really ready for this? Something feels different this time." Jack answered without looking at her, his voice echoing like a whisper in an empty room. "We're always ready. Speed and precision. That's all we need. There's no room for mistakes." Despite his calm words, unease was etched onto every face in the room. But orders had been given, and there was no turning back. The team filed out of headquarters, boarding their vehicles, which waited like specters in the dark. Engines hummed to life and they moved toward the warehouse, a silent block on the city's outskirts, surrounded by dead trees and abandoned buildings, a graveyard of forgotten dreams. The convoy halted a distance away, and the team disembarked, moving silently like shadows in the night. Jack advanced cautiously, the weight of the air pressing down on him. The wind carried the scent of fear, and dry leaves crunched beneath their feet like whispered warnings. Through his earpiece, Jack's voice came as a low murmur. "Is everyone in position? We breach in 30 seconds." Anna, beside him, felt her heartbeat pounding loudly in her ears. "I don't know why, but I've got a bad feeling," she whispered. Jack glanced at her, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll be fine. Just remember the training." Before anyone could respond, gunfire erupted from within the warehouse, as though hell itself had been unleashed. Screams and shots tore through the air, chaos engulfing everything. Sam's voice shouted over the comms, "Fall back! Retreat immediately." But it was too late. The trap had been sprung, and disorder swallowed the scene whole. The team scrambled for cover as bullets shredded the air around them. Amid the chaos, a figure emerged from the shadows, moving steadily toward the warehouse. Clad in a black leather coat, his hair whipped by the wind, his eyes obscured but his steps unwavering, he seemed like a phantom stepping into a nightmare. Jack whispered in disbelief, "Mesh! What is he doing here?" Mesh advanced toward the gang as though the bullets were meaningless. In swift, precise movements, he disarmed one of the criminals and brought him to the ground. He didn't stop, moving through the fray like a machine designed for destruction. "Who is that lunatic?" one of the officers shouted. But Mesh moved through the chaos like a dancer in a tragic play, taking down the criminals one by one. Within minutes, he had carved a path for the police to advance. "Mesh, stop! This is dangerous!" Jack shouted, trying to reach him. But Mesh didn't hear, or perhaps didn't want to. He was locked in his own world, driven by something no one else could see. Finally, an officer managed to grab him, shoving him to the ground. "Hands up! You're under arrest!" Mesh complied, raising his hands slowly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "How am I supposed to raise my hands when I'm already on the ground?" Once the situation was under control, Mesh was handcuffed and placed in a police car. Jack stood nearby, feeling helpless and confused. How had it come to this? Who was Mesh now? Friend or foe? Sam approached the car, peering at Mesh through the glass. "I want to talk to him." The officer opened the door and pulled Mesh out. He was calm, his eyes devoid of emotion. Sam asked coldly, "Who are you? And why did you intervene?" Mesh replied, his voice distant like an echo from another place. "Just someone who sees what you don't. I thought you might need some help." Sam eyed him carefully, then glanced at Jack before turning back to Mesh. "Your skills aren't ordinary, but you can't interfere in our operations." Mesh smiled faintly. "Don't worry, I won't make it a habit." Jack, seething with a mix of anger and confusion, demanded, "Mesh, what's going on? Why are you doing this?" Mesh looked at him, his gaze shrouded in the same mystery that had always surrounded him. "Maybe time will tell, Jack. Or maybe it won't." Sam let him go, but the questions lingered heavy and unanswered. Who was Mesh, really? And what was his story? That night, Jack sat in his office, surrounded by shadows. Anna entered and sat across from him in silence. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" she asked quietly. "I can't understand him. He was my friend, but now he's a stranger." "Maybe he carries a burden we don't know about. Everyone has their ghosts." Jack looked at her, his eyes filled with deep sadness. "I feel like I've lost something, or someone." Anna placed her hand gently over his. "You're not alone in this. We're here for you." Chapter 4. Echoes of the Past. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the city was drenched in a gray fog. In his office, Jack stared at the pile of reports on his desk, but his mind was elsewhere. The image of Mesh intervening in the operation haunted him. Who was this person he had known since childhood, but never truly understood? Anna entered, carrying a stack of new files. "There are reports of suspicious activity in the Western District." Jack nodded without looking up. "All right, we'll look into it." She sat beside him, concern etched on her face. "Jack, you need to talk to Mesh. This can't keep going on like this." Jack sighed. "I've tried. He keeps shutting me out." Maybe he doesn't need someone to question him. Maybe he needs someone to listen. The government had started to notice Mesh and his enigmatic interventions. They began to question his motives and his connection to the police. He was summoned for questioning, but he said nothing. Sitting in the interrogation room, surrounded by accusations and pointed questions, he remained silent, like a rock against a raging storm. "You're a threat to security," the investigator said. Mesh looked at him, his eyes devoid of emotion. "The threat comes from fear, and fear comes from ignorance." "What do you mean by that?" "It means you don't know me, and that's why you fear me." After hours of interrogation, they couldn't extract anything from him. They released him, but he knew the eyes would remain on him. Jack was waiting for him outside the station. "Why are you doing this? You're making things harder for everyone." Mesh smiled bitterly. "Maybe that's my destiny, to be a mystery." "I don't want to lose you again." Mesh looked at him deeply. "Maybe I didn't have a choice." In those days, Jack felt like the world around him was slowly crumbling. He found solace in Anna, who was always by his side. He decided to confront his feelings, to hold on to what was real in his life. One night, as they worked together, he said, "Anna, there's something I need to tell you." She looked at him with a faint smile. "I'm listening." "You're more than just a colleague. You're the light in this darkness." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "And you're more than just a friend." "Can we be more?" She nodded. "Yes, we can." 5 months later, they held a simple wedding, full of love. Friends and family gathered, their laughter filling the air. Mesh was there, standing in the shadows, watching from afar. At one point, he stepped onto the stage holding an old guitar and began playing a somber yet beautiful melody. The music carried unspoken words, telling a story of friendship, love, and loss. Everyone paused to listen, tears glistening in their eyes. Jack felt a weight on his heart, but was grateful. Despite everything, Mesh was a part of his life. After the performance, Mesh approached Jack. "I wish you happiness." Jack replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, my friend. I hope you find your peace." Mesh smiled faintly, then disappeared into the crowd like a ghost in the night. Chapter 5. The Breaking of Peace. Weeks after the grand celebration of Jack and Anna's wedding, the couple decided to escape the city's noise and find solace in a faraway place, somewhere the echoes of chaos couldn't reach them and the shadows of the past wouldn't follow. They sought peace in a world that seemed to have forgotten its meaning. The sun shyly filtered through the thick foliage surrounding the river, which flowed from a small waterfall. They sat on a wooden bench overlooking the cascade, watching the water rush as if fleeing from something unseen. The sky was unusually blue, as if tempting them to forget what they had left behind. Anna, gazing at the waterfall with a tired smile, said, "I feel like we're in a dream, like everything we've been through wasn't real." Jack, his eyes fixed on the horizon, replied, "Maybe we're in a time bubble where reality and responsibilities don't exist." She smiled wistfully. "I wish we could stay here forever, away from everything." He placed his hand gently over hers, but his gaze was lost elsewhere. "We can't run forever. The shadows will find us, no matter how far we go." They exchanged silence as if words had become too heavy to utter. Butterflies danced around them, but they didn't notice their beauty. There was an unspoken sense that this tranquility wouldn't last. Elsewhere, the shadows were stirring slowly. Mesh, who had grown closer to Sam, felt the weight of time pressing down on him. Their relationship had surpassed the ordinary, as though they shared a secret too great to reveal. One night, they sat together in Sam's modest home. The dim lights cast long shadows on the walls, and silence wrapped around the room. Sam, staring into his teacup, said, "Sometimes I feel like the world conspires against us, or maybe we conspire against ourselves." Mesh, his tone enigmatic, replied, "The world doesn't care about us. We're just ghosts passing through, unnoticed." Sam looked at him thoughtfully. "You carry too much inside you, Mesh. More than anyone should." Mesh smiled faintly. "We all carry our burdens, don't we? But some of them become part of us." When Jack and Anna returned to the city, the welcome was warm, but an odd tension lingered in the air. Colleagues smiled, but their smiles seemed strained. Mesh, with his inscrutable grin, decided to pull a prank. He unexpectedly lifted Jack off the ground. Laughter erupted, but it was hollow. Mesh, setting Jack down, said, "Things have changed here, but we're trying to stay the same." Jack looked at him quizzically, but before he could respond, the moment dissolved into the laughter of their peers. Beneath it all, something was stirring, something they couldn't name. Chapter 6: The Gift of Darkness. Routine returned to the police department, but the day carried a weight that could not be ignored. Sam sat in his office, feeling an unusual unease creeping into his heart. It was his birthday, though he hadn't told anyone. Mesh entered the office, carrying a carefully wrapped black box. "I found this at the door. Looks like it's for you." Sam looked at the box, an eerie feeling taking hold of him. Who would send me a gift? He opened the box cautiously. His expression froze and his breath caught in his chest. Inside the box was a severed human hand, meticulously arranged as if it were a grotesque piece of art. His heart raced and a heavy silence fell over the room. Jack and Anna entered, stopping in their tracks at the sight. Jack picked up the accompanying note, his voice trembling as he read aloud, "The hand of corruption will no longer rule this city." Their gazes met, each filled with 1,000 unanswered questions. Mesh, his voice calm but laced with mystery, said, "It seems someone has decided to declare war in their own way." Anna, her voice faint, asked, "Who could do something like this?" "What's happening?" Jack, feeling the weight of the words, replied, "It's a message. Someone is trying to tell us something." Sam stood, trying to gather his composure. "We need to be cautious. This isn't an ordinary threat." Mesh looked at the severed hand, then at Sam. Perhaps this is just the beginning. Darkness is closing in. That night, they gathered in the office, shadows surrounding them from all sides. A sense of helplessness began to seep into their spirits. Anna, trying to appear strong, asked, "What's our next move? We can't just wait for something else to happen." Jack, his eyes staring into the void, replied, "We'll search for any clue, any lead. We can't stand idle." Mesh, gazing out the window at the darkened city, said, "Maybe there are no clues. Maybe that's the point." Sam, his voice heavy with exhaustion, said, "No, we'll find a way. We can't let fear take over." In that moment, they all realized that the calm they had lived in was merely an illusion. The shadows they had tried to escape had caught up to them, and the faint whispers had grown louder than ever. The following morning, as the sun struggled to pierce through the thick clouds, Jack stood on the rooftop, looking out over a city that seemed to be drowning in a sea of fog. Mesh approached, standing silently beside him. After a long silence, Jack said, "I feel like we're losing control, like we're fighting an enemy we can't see." Mesh, his voice soft, replied, "Perhaps the enemy is us, our fears, our ghosts, our past that refuses to die." Jack looked at him, trying to understand. "What do you mean?" Mesh smiled faintly, then said, "Sometimes what we try to escape eventually catches up to us. We can't run from ourselves." Jack left him, the growing unease settling deeper within him. He knew things would never be the same again, and that the shadows had become a part of their lives. Chapter 7. The Game of Shadows. Days passed slowly, weighed down by an oppressive atmosphere since the arrival of the first box at the police station, the box containing the severed hand of a corrupt businessman. The air in the department was charged with an invisible tension, as if it were thick with unease and anticipation. There had been no progress in the investigations, no leads to the killer, not even a glimmer of hope that they were getting closer to the truth. Everyone was waiting for the next move, but no one could have predicted what it would be. One night, after another endless day of work, Jack and Anna sat in the living room of their small home. The TV played programs they weren't paying attention to, mere sounds and moving images filling the heavy silence that blanketed the space. Anna, her voice quiet, said as she stared at the screen without interest, "I feel like we're living in a strange dream, like none of this is real." Jack, his eyes fixed on the void, replied, "Maybe we're stuck in an endless loop, trying to escape it in vain." The sudden ringing of the doorbell shattered the quiet that hung over them like a thick curtain. Jack glanced at Anna, whose face was frozen in apprehension, then rose slowly, as if moving in another world. "Who could it be at this hour?" she asked nervously. Jack made his way to the door and opened it cautiously, but no one was there. The streets were empty, the dim lights casting eerie shadows on the pavement. But there, on the doorstep, was a small black box, pristine and carefully placed as if waiting for them. Jack bent down and picked up the box, reading the words written on it in elegant script. To Jack. A chill ran down his spine as though the air had suddenly grown colder. He brought the box inside, placed it on the table, and sat before it in silence. Anna approached slowly, her eyes filled with worry. "Is this like the box that Sam received?" she asked in a trembling voice. Jack nodded without speaking. He picked up his phone and called Mesh, his voice low but charged with tension. "Mesh, are you awake?" Mesh's voice came groggily from the other end but carried a note of alertness. "Yes, what's going on?" "I got another box. You need to come over right away." Shortly after, Mesh arrived. He entered the room, his eyes shifting from the box to their tense faces. He said with forced calm, "We won't know what's inside until we open it." Jack hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached out and began to open the box. As he lifted the lid, the blood froze in their veins. Inside the box was a severed human head, meticulously arranged in a chillingly precise manner. The skull had been opened, and the brain was missing. The features were serene, as though the person were in a deep sleep. Anna stumbled backward, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a scream. Jack felt the world spinning around him, the room closing in. Mesh picked up a small note placed beside the head and read it aloud in a quiet voice. The mind that betrayed justice will remain no more. The three of them exchanged looks, the sense of helplessness creeping into their hearts like an encroaching shadow. Jack, his voice hoarse, said, "It's a message. But who is it from? And what do they want?" Mesh, his gaze still fixed on the severed head, replied, "Perhaps we're caught in a game we don't understand." That night, they realized that the shadows chasing them were closer than they had imagined, and that escaping this nightmare might be impossible. Chapter 8: The Rise of Chaos. In a night cloaked by darkness like a heavy veil, Mesh sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, surrounded by a silence broken only by his slow breathing. The smoke from his cigarette rose sluggishly, dissipating into the air as if trying to escape an unforgiving reality. Outside, the city seemed like a slumbering beast, dreaming of nothing. He muttered to himself, exhaling smoke. What lies ahead in this endless night? The sharp sound of the doorbell shattered the stillness, like a drum roll heralding an impending storm. He rose slowly, approached the door, and opened it cautiously. No one was there, only a pristine black box, neatly wrapped, sitting at his doorstep like a gift from fate. He stared at the box with hollow eyes. Not again. Bringing it inside, he placed it on the table and sat before it, as if awaiting an inevitable judgment. He picked up his phone and called Jack. "I've received another box. I'll be there in minutes." When Jack arrived, his face bore the marks of exhaustion and worry. The two of them sat before the box, as though it were a mirror reflecting their deepest fears. Jack spoke in a low voice. "I feel like this is worse than the last one." Mesh responded with a faint smile. "Maybe this time it'll be a pleasant surprise." But both of them knew that hope was a lie. They opened the box slowly, fearing that a nightmare might emerge. Inside the box was a piece of human skin, meticulously removed and tattooed with the symbol of a notorious gang. Words etched in cold blood read, "Let chaos reign." Jack murmured, his hands trembling. This is madness. He's targeting the gangs now." Mesh, his eyes fixed on the skin, replied, "He wants to set the city on fire. He wants to burn it all down." Mesh's phone suddenly rang, breaking the suffocating silence. It was Sam on the line. "I heard you got another box. What's inside this time?" "Skin of a gang leader. Things are getting worse." Elsewhere in the city, the gang gathered in a dimly lit room, smoke filling the air, their faces taut with tension and fear. Their leader's disappearance left a void filled with anxiety. "We can't just sit here, we need to do something," one of them shouted. The gang leader's son entered, his face grim, his eyes burning with a mix of rage and despair. "We received a call. My father is dead." Silence enveloped the room, as if the words had stolen all sound. "We'll find whoever did this, and they'll pay." At that moment, chaos spread like an infection, unstoppable. In Mesh's apartment, tension hung in the air like poison. Jack, his voice hoarse, said, "I can't stop thinking about Anna." "What if the killer comes for us?" Mesh placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, his eyes filled with an understanding of fear. "We'll protect her, but we need to act. The killer wants us scared. Let's not give him that satisfaction." Sam, standing by the window and gazing at the city succumbing to chaos, asked, "What do you suggest?" Mesh's eyes gleamed with cold determination. "We need to change the rules, become the hunters, not the prey." In that moment, they realized that confrontation was inevitable, and the chaos surrounding them was a reflection of the absurdity consuming their lives. Chapter 9. Voices in the Dark. In the early morning, when the sun's faint rays barely pierced through the windows, Jack prepared to leave the house. Anna sat on the couch, clutching a small blanket, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She spoke softly. "Jack, I'm sorry, but I can't go to work today. I'm not feeling well. I think I just need some rest." Jack approached her, concern etched on his face. He sat beside her and gently touched her forehead. "Are you okay? Don't worry about work. Take your time to rest. I'll handle everything." She gave a faint smile. "I'll be fine, just a little tired." He kissed her forehead gently before leaving. Though a vague worry lingered in his heart, he didn't want to add to her stress. He headed to the police station, where the air was thick with tension following the recent crimes. At the station, whispers spread among the officers. The policeman who had delivered the first box to Sam had vanished without a trace. As Jack and Mesh discussed the ongoing cases, Sam's phone rang. The call was from the missing policeman's young daughter. Her voice trembled with fear. "Uncle Sam, my dad didn't come home last night. I've called him so many times, but he doesn't answer. I'm scared. Where is he?" Ice coursed through Sam's veins. He tried to soothe her with a calm voice. "Don't worry, sweetheart. We'll find him right away. I'm sure he's okay." But inside, he knew something dark was unfolding. After the call, Sam tried to mask his worry, but Jack caught the look in his eyes. Before they could discuss it further, another box arrived at the station. A black box identical to the previous ones. Jack opened it with trembling hands. Inside were two severed human hands, clean and neatly arranged. Beside them was a piece of paper covered in cryptic symbols. Jack whispered, "What is this?" "There's no clear message this time." Mesh picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the symbols. "These aren't just symbols. They're a code. Maybe a message meant for us." Mesh began deciphering the symbols, the tension in the room mounting. After several minutes, he looked up, his eyes filled with alarm. The hidden words mentioned the devil and Anna. Jack froze in place. "Anna? What does that mean?" His heart pounded as he bolted out of the station without waiting for an answer. He raced home, bursting through the door and calling out in a trembling voice, "Anna!" She emerged from the bedroom, confusion on her face. "Jack, what's wrong?" He rushed to her and enveloped her in a tight embrace. "I was worried about you. Something happened at work." She looked at him with concern. "What's going on? Tell me." He hesitated for a moment, then said, "We received a cryptic message, and your name was mentioned. I just wanted to make sure you're okay." She smiled gently and placed a hand on his face. "I'm fine, don't worry. Maybe it's just a coincidence." But deep down, Jack knew it wasn't that simple. Returning to the station, he found Mesh and Sam waiting for him. "There's more to the code," Mesh said. "It's a dark poem, carrying a greater threat." Sam read the words aloud in a low voice. "In every corner, shadows creep, swallowing light, planting seeds deep. I am the darkness that won't depart. I am the devil, and you are the unknown." Silence filled the room. Jack, his voice barely audible, said, "He's threatening all of us. He's playing a dangerous game." Mesh replied, "He's not just a killer. He believes he's embodying something greater." Sam sighed heavily. "We need to be cautious. We don't know what his next move will be." That night, the three of them sat in a dimly lit room, shadows closing in around them. They felt as though they were trapped in a labyrinth with no way out, where every step could lead them closer to the abyss. Chapter 10. Cries of the Black Boxes. The city was drowning in a vortex of fear and chaos. The crimes kept escalating, and the black boxes carried messages of terror and blood. The police force teetered on the edge of collapse, with questions multiplying faster than answers. On a grim morning, the Parliament received 2 black boxes, carefully wrapped and addressed to the heart of authority. Tala, a young employee, sat trembling in the corner of the room, her eyes brimming with tears. "We found them at the back entrance. No one knows how they got there," she said in a shaky voice. Jack, Anna, and Sam arrived at the scene, their faces bearing the weight of past horrors. They stood before the boxes, knowing that what lay inside would be no less horrifying than what they'd seen before. Sam cautiously opened the first box. Their faces froze as they saw a human tongue, placed meticulously on a black cloth. The accompanying note read in trembling words, "The tongue of lies will speak no more." Anna whispered, "It's the corrupt politician, known for his deceptive speeches." They closed the box and moved to the second one. Sam opened it slowly to reveal a human heart, barely pulsating, connected to thin wires. He read the message, "The heart of betrayal has stopped." Jack murmured, his voice hoarse, "It's the police officer who was colluding with the gangs." The messages were clear. The killer was targeting symbols of corruption, sending a challenge to the entire establishment. Outside, they found Mesh waiting for them, sitting on his motorcycle, a mysterious look on his face. He said with a smirk, "It seems the killer is feeling generous with his gifts." Jack stared at him sternly. "Things are getting worse. He's not just killing. He wants to dismantle the entire system." Mesh replied, his eyes gazing into the distance. "Maybe he thinks he's the hero of his own story." They exchanged glances, each knowing that a confrontation was drawing near. Back at the police station, they convened to discuss their next steps. Sam spoke firmly. "We need to be faster than him. We need to think like he does." Mesh added, "He's playing a psychological game. He wants us scared, to lose control." Anna, her eyes shining with determination, said, "We won't let him win. We'll stop him." At that moment, they realized the killer wasn't just a person. He was an idea, embodied in terrifying acts. Facing him meant confronting the darkness creeping into everyone's hearts. Chapter 11. Echo of Shadows. Dawn was breaking slowly, and the city stirred from its slumber while darkness still clung to the streets. At the police station, calm prevailed. Only a few officers wandered between desks, awaiting the end of their shift. Mesh sat at a small table surrounded by scattered papers, passing the time until the new day began. A young officer approached Mesh with a faint smile. "You've been here since dawn, Mesh. Don't you feel tired?" Mesh looked at him with weary eyes and replied in a quiet voice, "Sometimes staying awake helps me think. All these cases, I feel like I'm part of something bigger, even if I don't fully understand it." Another officer joined them with a playful laugh. "Looks like you've become the philosopher among us, Mesh, thinking of joining us full-time." Mesh offered a faint smile. "Not yet, but I've learned a lot here, especially from Sam." A brief silence followed as Mesh's gaze drifted to the cracked walls, as if searching for hidden answers. He murmured, almost inaudibly, "Sam works hard. Not many are like him. He seems to see something in this work, something beyond duty, maybe a search for justice." The young officer looked at him in surprise. "It's rare to hear you talk about others like that. You really admire him, don't you?" Mesh's eyes glimmered with distant memories. "Yes, he reminds me of Jack. Jack was like an older brother to me. When I needed help, he was the one who stood by my side." At that moment, movement stirred in the station as Sam, Jack, and Anna arrived. Their faces bore signs of exhaustion, but their eyes burned with resolve. Sam spoke with a serious tone as he walked to his office. "We need to follow every lead carefully. We can't fail this time." Jack nodded. "We're getting close to something. The killer keeps sending messages. It's clear he's trying to make a specific point." As they moved toward their desks, the quiet was shattered by the screech of a car braking abruptly outside the station. They exchanged quick glances and rushed to the door. An old car was parked awkwardly, its back door slightly ajar, smoke rising from the engine. A heavy, ominous atmosphere hung over the scene. Sam advanced cautiously and said in a low voice, "Stay alert. This could be a trap." Mesh and Sam approached the car, and Sam slowly opened the back door. What they saw froze the blood in their veins. Inside were two mutilated bodies. The first was a corrupt lawyer, his eyes gruesomely removed. The second was a notorious drug dealer, his nose grotesquely severed. Anna stepped back, placing a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. This can't be real." Jack tried to maintain his composure, but felt anger rising within him. Mesh, his voice calm but strained, said, "He's sending us more messages." Same style, same horrifying precision. Sam bent down and picked up two notes attached to the bodies. He read the first in a soft voice. "The eyes that turned blind to justice will no longer see." Jack grabbed the note, his eyes blazing with fury. "That man defended the corrupt. He was part of the system we're fighting against." Sam set the note aside and read the second. "The nose that smelled death will no longer sniff profit." Anna looked at the second body, her voice trembling. "That's the drug dealer. Everyone knows him. The killer knows exactly who he's targeting." Jack felt a storm of anger and helplessness brewing within him. He struck the car with his fist, his voice filled with despair. This killer knows what he's doing. He's trying to tear the city apart from within. Sam ordered the ambulance to be called as they stood in a heavy silence, feeling the shadows growing thicker around them. After the ambulance left, Mesh returned inside, his eyes carrying a resolute determination. He gathered the officers in the briefing room and stood before them, speaking with a strong voice. "We've had enough of feeling powerless. This killer is playing us like puppets, and we're standing still. We're here to protect this city, not to watch it fall apart." The officers exchanged glances, the weight of helplessness pressing on them. Mesh continued, his eyes shining with resolve. "I'm not a cop, but I'm here to help. We need to be stronger, to act faster." He turned to Sam and said, "You're our leader. We're counting on you." Sam took a deep breath, feeling the heavy burden of responsibility. He spoke calmly. "We won't let this killer win. We'll work together to stop him." At that moment, Sam decided to contact the government for additional support. After a brief discussion, the government agreed to send a professional investigator. The next morning, a tall man with sharp eyes entered the station. Jack and Mesh recognized him immediately. Jack said in surprise, "Ned, you're the investigator they sent?" Ned smiled faintly. "Yes, looks like we'll be working together again." They exchanged greetings, and a glimmer of hope returned. Ned sat with them and began asking questions. Unspoken tensions lingered, old memories resurfacing. After the sessions ended, Ned found Mesh sitting alone outside the station, smoking a cigarette. He approached him and asked softly, "Why do you do this to yourself?" Mesh looked at him with a sad smile. "Pain makes me feel like I'm still here." Ned sat beside him and said, "It's been years. I wish I'd acted better in the past." Mesh sighed. "The past doesn't die easily, but maybe we can start over." Ned smiled. "Maybe. But for now, we have work to do." Before leaving, Mesh handed Ned a paper. "This might help you." Ned looked at the paper and felt a vague unease. In his office, Ned read the message. "In every corner and every turn, there's an eye watching. Corruption seeps into every crevice. I am the light that will be consumed by hellfire. The next victim is Mesh." A chill ran down his spine. Mesh is in danger. He tried contacting Jack and Sam, but received no response. Time felt like it was slipping away, and the shadows moved faster. Chapter 12. Disappearance in the Shadows. The following day was fraught with tension. Ned entered the police station, his eyes glinting with urgency. He found Jack, Anna, and Sam in the briefing room. "We have a big problem," Ned said quickly. Jack looked at him with concern. "What's going on?" Ned threw the paper onto the table. "The killer is targeting Mesh. He's the next victim." Their faces froze in shock. Sam said firmly, "We need to act immediately. Where is Mesh?" Ned replied, "I tried calling him, but he's not answering. I don't know where he is." They all rushed to Mesh's apartment. When they arrived, the door was slightly ajar. Entering cautiously, their hearts pounded with dread. The apartment was in disarray. The furniture was shattered, the walls scratched. His beloved guitar lay broken on the floor, and his leather jacket was torn and discarded. Anna felt nauseous, her voice trembling as she said, "Where is he?" Jack stood in the center of the room, feeling powerless. He murmured softly, "They took him." Ned sat on the floor, running a hand over his face. "How did I not see this coming?" They felt the shadows closing in, the weight of losing one of their own bearing down on them. Sam, with determination in his voice, said, "We need to find him. We'll use every resource available." They began analyzing the evidence, searching for any thread that could lead them to Mesh. In an unknown location, Mesh was missing, engulfed in darkness. No sound, no movement, only a heavy silence. Back at the police station, they worked tirelessly. Ned said, "The last signal from his phone was in the old industrial zone." Sam ordered an immediate operation. When they reached the location, they found nothing but abandoned buildings and long shadows. Jack muttered, "Where are you, Mesh?" Returning to the station, the weight of failure hung heavily over them. Ned, his voice breaking, said, "We've failed." But Jack stood, his eyes burning with determination. "It's not over yet. We'll find him, no matter what it takes." The others looked at him, feeling a glimmer of hope despite the suffocating darkness around them. Chapter 13. The Spiral of Absence. The first day of Mesh's disappearance felt like time itself had stopped. The entire city seemed submerged in a heavy silence, as if refusing to acknowledge the present. Streets once alive with noise now lay empty, and faces that used to wear smiles were etched with worry and unending uncertainty. At the police station, where hope usually found a way, a suffocating atmosphere of helplessness prevailed. Sam sat in his office, surrounded by scattered papers and endless details about the case. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air growing heavier and harder to breathe. Mesh wasn't just an assistant or colleague. He was like a son, a part of Sam's soul. And now, with Mesh gone, lost in endless shadows, Sam felt as though a piece of himself had been ripped away. That night he returned home, but no solace awaited him. The windows were shut tight and darkness engulfed the room. He sat in his living room, surrounded by photos and memories that only deepened his pain. Rage and despair surged within him like a storm refusing to relent. He screamed into the emptiness. Why? Why couldn't I protect him? Why am I here while he's gone? In his fury, Sam grabbed a glass and hurled it at the wall. It shattered, its shards scattering across the room, but he didn't care. He paced the house, searching for something lost, destroying whatever came in his path. The table flipped, books and pictures toppled to the floor. Then he stopped abruptly. A photograph caught his eye, himself, Mesh, and Jack, back in simpler times when the world seemed clearer. With trembling hands, he picked up the photo, tears streaming down his face. "You were like a son to me," he whispered. Silent tears fell, the weight of his grief consuming him. 3 weeks had passed since Mesh's disappearance. The station was in chaos, officers wandering the halls like ghosts. Crimes continued, and the cryptic messages only made things worse. There was no progress, as if they were chasing an invisible specter. On April 4th, the government stepped in with increased involvement. 3 new investigators arrived: Hamad al-Sulami, Ali al-Shamrani, and Ned. They gathered in the briefing room, surrounded by stacks of reports and files. Hamad, his voice tinged with frustration, said, 3 weeks, and we still have nothing. How can someone vanish like this without leaving a single trace? Ali glanced at the scattered reports. Something's missing. Mesh's disappearance, the crimes, the messages. It's all connected, but we can't see the full picture yet. Ned, who had been silent until then, spoke calmly. Jack has lost his balance. Mesh was more than a friend to him. We need to talk to him, but I'm not expecting much. Things are getting worse, and time isn't on our side. In his dimly lit office, Jack sat engulfed by shadows of the past. His bloodshot eyes bore witness to sleepless nights, and his face carried the anguish of a man broken from within. All he could see was Mesh's face, and every shared memory played before him like a film stuck on repeat. I should have been there. I left him again. How can I live with this? He whispered. His trembling hands held an old photo, a cruel reminder of a time that no longer existed. Guilt consumed him, gnawing at him like a shadow he couldn't escape. Anna entered quietly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Jack, you can't keep doing this to yourself. We all need you, and Mesh needs us to stay strong for him. Jack looked at her, his tear-filled eyes brimming with grief. He was my brother. I left him when he needed me. How can I forgive myself? Anna sat beside him, her voice tender. You can't blame yourself for everything. You couldn't have stopped this. But now we have to focus on what we can do. Jack closed his eyes, trying to calm the storm within him. But what if it's already too late? She held his hand firmly. It's not too late. We'll find him, together. Chapter 14. Return from Darkness. The night was unusually quiet. At the police station, the investigators busied themselves with routine tasks, trying to stave off the suffocating specter of failure. Hamad, Ali, and Ned sat around a table surrounded by reports and endless crime files. Ned spoke gravely. We have to set Mesh aside for now. The crimes are continuing, and the killer isn't waiting for us to catch up. Hamad nodded. We know it's hard, but we can't afford to lose more lives. Ali sighed. The latest messages suggest the killer is growing more confident. We have to move fast. At that moment, an eerie stillness settled over the station. Suddenly, the screeching sound of a car braking violently shattered the quiet. The investigators rushed to the window, trying to see what was happening. What's going on? Ali exclaimed. They hurried outside and found a person lying beside the car, motionless. As they approached cautiously, their steps slowed, and their hearts raced when they recognized him. Oh my God, it's Mesh, Hamad shouted. Mesh lay on the ground, his face pale, his wide-open eyes filled with indescribable terror. His body trembled, and fragmented words escaped his lips. Ned knelt beside him, his voice steady but urgent. Mesh, can you hear me? What happened to you? Mesh muttered faintly. The darkness, the torment, the devil. The team exchanged anxious glances, fear tightening its grip on them. Sam's voice trembled as he said, "We need to get him to the hospital immediately." At the hospital, they gathered around his bed, waiting for any sign of improvement. The doctor emerged with a puzzled expression. "Physically, he's almost fine, but his psychological state is extremely fragile," the doctor explained. Ned pressed him. "What do you mean? Has he been through psychological torture?" "It's evident he's endured a traumatic experience. He needs rest and close observation," the doctor replied. Sam sat by Mesh's bedside, tears streaming down his face. "You're back with us. I thought we'd lost you forever." In the corner of the room, Jack stood motionless, the weight of guilt pressing heavily on his shoulders. "How could I leave him? How could I let this happen?" he muttered to himself. Anna approached him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Jack, you can't change the past, but you can be here for him now." Jack looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I failed him. He needed me, and I wasn't there." She squeezed his hand. "He still needs you. This is your chance to make it right." Later that night, Ned sat in the waiting room, piecing together the fragments of Mesh's murmured words. The darkness, the torment, the devil. He spoke aloud to himself. What does it mean? Is the killer playing with our minds? Sam entered and sat beside him. "We need to find out what happened to him." Ned nodded. "We will. Whatever darkness he faced, we'll face it with him." In that moment, they realized the battle was far from over. The shadows surrounding them were deeper than they'd imagined, but they were determined to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. Chapter 15. The Maze of Memory. They left Mesh in the hospital room, where the walls seemed to close in on him, laden with a suffocating silence pressing down on his chest. He lay on the bed, submerged in a deep sleep induced by sedatives. Yet even in his dreams, he found no peace. Time passed agonizingly slowly, loaded with unbearable tension, as everyone waited for him to wake up, though none of them knew what would happen when he opened his eyes. In an adjacent hospital room, Ned, Hamad, and Ali sat around a small table. Papers were scattered before them, their faces shadowed with concern. "How can we ignore the truth?" Hamad said seriously. "Mesh returned alive. Why? Why did the killer choose to spare him? If that's the case, there must be a reason." Ali interrupted. "Exactly. If the killer intended to end his life, he could have done it long ago. This isn't a coincidence. Something much bigger is happening here." Ned, who had been silently listening, felt his heart resist the idea that Mesh could be implicated in this chaos. "No," he said with quiet conviction. "I don't think Mesh is involved. He's a victim, not a perpetrator. The killer likely wanted something else from him, but what Mesh endured was far beyond a simple attempt on his life. This person might have sought to break him psychologically." Hamad looked at him skeptically. "You say he's a victim, but the killer didn't kill him. Why? Why spare him?" Ned's words quickened. "Because the killer doesn't want him dead. He wants something else, perhaps to send a message through him or to turn him into a tool. But what Mesh went through is unimaginable, psychological torment. We can't even fathom it." Ali hesitated. "I'm not saying Mesh is the killer, but we can't dismiss the possibilities. Maybe there's something we're refusing to see because we don't want to believe it." At that moment, Sam entered the room, his face flushed with anger. He advanced toward Hamad and Ali, his voice trembling with rage. "How dare you doubt Mesh? That boy has given us more than you can imagine. He was always there for us, standing by our side every time we needed him." Hamad attempted to justify himself. "Sam, we're not saying he's directly involved, but we can't ignore the facts. The killer didn't harm him while he killed others without hesitation." Sam retorted sharply. "Have you forgotten how he risked his life for us? How he stayed up with us, trying to understand how to become better. And now, after everything he's been through, you dare question his intentions? Ned tried to calm the situation. Sam, we're not blaming Mesh, but we need to understand what happened. The killer isn't ordinary, and there's something about his methods that forces us to question everything. Sam insisted. Mesh is not part of this. He's a victim, just like the others. Tension filled the room, a heavy weight bearing down on everyone. Sam felt compelled to defend a friend who couldn't even defend himself. Ned said quietly, "We need to let things unfold. The investigation isn't over and we can't jump to conclusions. Mesh needs time to recover, and we need to focus on finding out who's behind all this." Sam looked at Ned, his eyes brimming with mixed emotions, then left the room without a word, leaving behind an air of sadness and anger. 2 days had passed since Mesh was admitted to the hospital, surrounded by an air of mystery. Under the influence of sedatives, he remained asleep in his hospital bed, oblivious to what had happened to him. When he finally opened his eyes, there was no light in them. They were empty, as if lost in another world. The doctor standing beside him spoke gently. "How are you feeling? Can you speak?" Mesh looked around slowly, as though the place was unfamiliar to him. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "I feel fine, but I don't remember anything. What happened to me?" Everyone was stunned. How could someone who had endured such a terrifying ordeal wake up and speak as though nothing had happened? How could his mind erase all those details? Ned, who had been observing cautiously, stepped closer. "When you returned to us, you were saying strange things. You mentioned the devil and torment. Do you remember anything about that?" Mesh looked at him with vacant eyes. "No, I don't remember anything. Did I say that? I don't think so." Mesh's words struck like a dagger to their hearts. They had lived through the terror of his return in a pitiful state, and now he had no memory of what had happened. Chapter 16. Fire Beneath the Ashes. In a dark basement beneath an abandoned building, the crime lord's son sat with his men around a worn wooden table. Dim lights cast eerie shadows over their tense faces, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke. The son spoke sharply. "We're not playing the same game anymore. They took my father, and with him, our dignity. We didn't just lose a man, we lost a symbol. And now it's time to make them pay." One of the men hesitated before asking, "What do you want us to do? Attack the police directly? That's suicide." The son smirked coldly. "The police aren't the target right now. We don't need a direct attack. We'll strike them in unexpected places. We'll terrify them, take their lives before they even know where we've come from." The men exchanged uneasy glances. They knew things would spiral out of control if they started targeting the police directly. "How do we pull this off?" another man asked cautiously. Lighting a cigarette, the son exhaled the smoke slowly. "We'll start with a sudden strike. Nothing big at first, just enough to send a message, a simple pharmacy. But we're not going for the money. Money is no longer our goal. We'll go for their lives." "Why a pharmacy?" a man asked, skepticism lacing his tone. The son replied, his gaze fixed on the swirling smoke, "Because it's unexpected. The police won't think we'd start with something so small. They'll assume we're after cash, but they'll be shocked when we take the life of any officer who crosses us. The crazier and more unpredictable the strike, the more fear we'll plant in their hearts." Silence hung in the air as they tried to process his words. This wasn't just a robbery, it was a calculated plan to spread chaos and fear. "But killing an officer will bring their wrath on us. We might lose everything," one of them said hesitantly. The son replied icily, "We crossed the point of no return the moment they took my father. From now on, we'll be the ghost that haunts them. They'll never find peace again." The men began dividing tasks, executing the plan with precision. The son knew there was no room for failure. This wasn't just about money or power anymore. It was about complete revenge. "Tonight," he said with steely determination, "we begin the war. Our motto will be, 'Their souls, not their wealth.'" Chapter 17. Echoes of Solitude. The atmosphere in the meeting room was heavy with tension. Ned sat at the head of the table, flanked by Hamad al-Sulami and Ali al-Shamrani. Papers lay scattered across the surface as everyone struggled to piece together the identity of the elusive killer. Hamad spoke with unease. "None of the evidence points to a specific individual. The killer leaves no tangible trace behind." Ali replied, "But there's a clear pattern. All the victims are tied to corruption in one way or another. The killer has a motive, and he aims to dismantle everyone who's a part of this system." Ned listened silently, his gaze fixed on the papers in front of him, though his mind was elsewhere. After a brief pause, he spoke. "This killer isn't an ordinary person. He's playing a complex game, a psychological one before it's physical." Hamad hesitated before asking, "Do you think there's a connection between him and what's happening to Mesh?" Ned looked up, pausing briefly before answering. But before he could respond, his phone rang with an urgent call from the police station. At the station, the mood had shifted dramatically since Mesh's return. The officers' faces were lit with smiles, and they exchanged stories about the times they'd shared with him. Even Sam seemed to have returned to his old self. Mesh stood silently in a corner of the room, observing everyone. His eyes carried sorrow and exhaustion, but there was also a hint of relief. He felt he was back where he belonged, with people he considered family. Sam approached him with a warm smile. "You're back, and that's all that matters now. We're all here for you, Mesh." Mesh replied in a quiet voice. "I know, Sam. I feel guilty for causing all this worry. I never wanted any of this to happen." Fahima laughed lightly. "What's important is that you're back. We're all happy to have you." Shakir added emotionally, "I'm glad you're back, brother. I won't let you drift away again." Mesh smiled faintly but couldn't shake the inner turmoil that haunted him. "I need to step out for a bit," he said softly. "I'll go to the pharmacy. I need to pick up some medication." Sam asked with concern, "Do you want someone to go with you?" Mesh shook his head, smiling. "No need to worry. I'll be fine. I just need some time to myself." He left the station quietly, leaving behind an atmosphere of happiness as he headed toward the pharmacy. He knew, however, that the world outside the station was far from serene. Mesh walked slowly down the street, his steps heavy as if the ground were draining his strength with every step. The sky was overcast with gray clouds, mirroring his inner state. The sounds of life around him were present but felt distant, irrelevant. Everything inside him was muddled, restless, and filled with regret. He sighed deeply and spoke to himself. "How did I get here? How did I let myself become this weak?" He thought about the guitar that had been destroyed, the one thing he had always clung to. Those strings that once carried his sorrows were now just shattered memories. "It was the only thing that gave me a voice when no one else heard me," he muttered. "And now, even it is gone." He recalled the long nights spent with the guitar, playing melodies that no one but the walls ever heard. It had been the vessel for his suppressed screams, witnessing every moment of solitude and loss. Now it was broken, just as he felt inside. With a voice tinged with grief, he said, "How foolish I was. I let myself get caught in a spiral of loneliness and failure. I let everything fall apart around me, and I did nothing. I thought I could stand on my own, but I couldn't." As he walked, he saw a small child in the distance, holding his father's hand. The child laughed and jumped, brimming with excitement for life, while the father smiled warmly at him. It was a simple scene, yet it stung Mesh deeply. Watching the child with sorrowful eyes, he murmured, "How do they feel so secure? How can a child feel such safety and love? I never had that." Memories of his own childhood crept into his mind, memories starkly different from what he saw before him. He had no hand to hold when he was young, no one to reassure him that everything would be okay. Bitterly, he said, "Why was I always alone? Even when I surrounded myself with others, I felt invisible. Now I realize how lonely I truly was, even in the times I thought I was fine." He felt that his life had been a form of escape from loneliness, from his past. He had tried to fill the void left by a missing family with anything that would make him feel alive. But now, he couldn't run anymore. Everything was clear before him. The life he had lived was a series of mistakes and regrets. As he continued walking, his voice, heavy with sorrow, said, "Everything is broken, not just the guitar. I've been lying to myself all this time. I thought I could bear the weight of the world on my own, but I was wrong. All I've ever done was run away, and running only brings loss." When he reached the pharmacy, he felt no urge to enter. He wasn't searching for medicine for physical pain. He knew that such drugs couldn't heal his real wound. Whispering to himself as he stood before the pharmacy's door, he said, "How do I heal myself now? How can I come back when everything has fallen apart? Is there really a cure for what I feel?" He stood there for a long moment, gathering the fragments of himself. He knew these moments wouldn't easily fade and wouldn't heal with a simple gesture. He had to confront all the ghosts that haunted him, whether from his past or his present. Chapter 18. The Accursed Pharmacy. The air was thick, as if trying to pull the breath out of everyone present. Silence weighed heavily, as if the walls themselves absorbed every sound except the restless breathing. Mesh stood between the shelves of the pharmacy, his muscles tense, his body in a constant state of alert. He wasn't particularly tall, but his physique was dense with strength, as if every muscle spoke of years of struggling with life. In that place, he was like a small volcano, hiding immense power, waiting for the right moment to erupt. When the door burst open violently, the men entered like a heavy shadow cast over the place. The gang leader's son led the way, his eyes sweeping the pharmacy as if they had already claimed everything. One of them was taller than Mesh, his body gaunt, as though he had been shaped by his past addiction. His shaky steps betrayed him, but the weapon in his hand seemed enough to compensate for his weakness. Or so he thought. "Nobody move!" the gang leader's son shouted, his voice tearing the silence to shreds. Everyone froze, as if the air itself commanded submission. Everyone but Mesh. His eyes, which observed everything, did not submit. Mesh was not a part of the fear that gripped the others. His eyes were fixed on the details, as if he were trying to read words written between silence and fear. The tall man, who stood close to Mesh, pointed his gun at his face. His hands trembled. His arm looked frail, as if it could hardly control the weapon it held. "Stay put, don't play the hero," he said in a shaky voice. Mesh wasn't playing. The rage coursing through his veins was neither childish nor theatrical. It was something real, too deep to describe. But he remained still, waiting for the moment to explode. The first shot, fired by the leader's son into the ceiling, shattered the silence like an invitation to chaos. It was a proclamation that blood would be spilled, and everyone knew this was no empty threat. The tall man standing near Mesh had no idea that the moment he moved would be his last. In that instant, he bent slightly to adjust his footing. This was the movement Mesh had been waiting for. He moved like a sudden surge, his hand grabbing the man's wrist that held the weapon, while his other hand pulled the small knife from his pocket. The stab was swift and precise, piercing the man's abdomen as if opening the gates of hell. The man's scream was short, but enough to make everyone freeze. His long body, despite its frailness, collapsed to the ground as if it were a tree whose trunk had been severed. Blood poured rapidly, flooding the white tiles like an angry signature of the chaos that had begun to engulf the place. The gang leader's son, who had been watching the scene, slowly raised his gun, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and fury. "Do you think you're a hero?" he shouted, but his voice carried a tremor he couldn't hide. Mesh didn't care. He looked at the man he had stabbed, watching the blood flow onto the floor. "You should have stayed away," he whispered, as if speaking more to himself than to anyone else. Then came the sound that changed everything. Another shot, but it wasn't aimed at Mesh. Sam, who had been trying to enter to calm things down from outside, took the bullet to his chest. The moment he fell was like a mountain collapsing. Time stopped and the sound faded, as if everything else had lost its meaning. Mesh rushed to him, as if trying to catch something slipping away. He knelt beside him, lifting his head in his hands, as blood slowly seeped from Sam's chest, writing an ending of its own. "Sam! Sam, no! Don't leave me!" Mesh cried, his voice laden with everything: grief, rage, helplessness. Sam looked at him, his eyes heavy with something more profound than pain. "Mesh," he said in a broken voice, but it carried meaning beyond words. "The world was never ours. It never was. We are ghosts, on the edge of hell. Don't let them take you, as they took me." Mesh stared into his eyes as if trying to hold on to time, but time was too unforgiving to be held. "Forgive me. Forgive me for not being strong enough." But Sam was no longer listening. His smile, closer to absurdity than farewell, was the last thing he left behind. When Mesh stood up, he was no longer human. He had become something else. His eyes burned with a madness beyond description. He moved slowly toward the other tall man standing by the gang leader's son. He grabbed his neck and lifted him into the air as if he were nothing. "One," Mesh said, pointing to the first body he had killed. Then he looked at the other man, who screamed and writhed as if knowing the end was near. "Two." He then threw him to the ground with all his strength. The sound that followed was like the world shattering. Bones cracked and blood splattered like a small explosion. The gang leader's son, watching the scene, began to back away. He raised his gun and fired. The bullet pierced Mesh's shoulder, but it didn't faze him. He didn't flinch, not even a bit. Mesh turned to him, his eyes reflecting hell itself. "Is that the best you've got?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm and rage. The gang leader's son fled, his steps trembling as if the ground could no longer bear him. He ran towards the back door as if fleeing a ghost that pursued him. But he didn't know that the inferno wasn't over yet. Mesh, standing in the middle of the blood, slowly turned towards the man who had killed Sam. His body lay on the ground, still twitching between life and death. Mesh didn't see a person. He saw the abyss that had taken Sam and left behind the echo of death. He walked towards him slowly, his steps heavy as if the ground cracked beneath his feet. His eyes gleamed with something close to madness. But it wasn't madness alone. It was rage, pain, and absurdity, all battling inside him, pushing him to become something indescribable. When he reached the body, he didn't speak. He stood over it for a moment, then raised his foot and crushed the man's face with all the strength he had. The sound was like glass shattering, but more brutal, more severe. "Nothingness." He said it in a voice drenched in madness, then raised his foot again and kicked the skull. Blood and bones splattered like a small explosion. "No forgiveness." A scream escaped him as he stomped the man's head again. The sound echoed through the place, but no one moved. The police were at the doors, but they didn't enter. They watched as if witnessing the end of the world. Nothing. Another kick, and the skull began to lose its shape. Blood covered the floor, but it wasn't enough to quench Mesh's fire. "This is justice." He said it, kneeling over the body, his fists pounding what was left of the face. Bones shattered under his hands, but that didn't stop him. Every punch felt like a proclamation of something greater, something inexplicable. "Forgive me, Sam. This is all I have now." He whispered between his heavy breaths, then lifted his hand again, striking with enough force to make the ground shake. He didn't stop until the face beneath his hands was nothing but a mass of flesh, bone, and blood. The police finally entered. Jack was the first to run towards Mesh. He saw his friend sitting over the corpse, drenched in blood, his hands covered in what no longer resembled a human. His body trembled, but not from exhaustion. Mesh's entire being was transforming into something beyond rage, something out of control. "Mesh, stop!" Jack shouted, his voice charged with both plea and fear. But he knew his words wouldn't reach. He knew Mesh wasn't there anymore. Mesh was somewhere else, somewhere deeper and darker than anyone could imagine. Mesh slowly lifted his head, turning to Jack with empty eyes like dark pits. His face was a mask of fury and tears. He breathed heavily, as if trying to remember what air felt like. "Jack, they took him. Sam is no longer here." His words were weighed down by defeat, but carried something far more dangerous. A loss of faith in anything. Jack approached cautiously, extending his hand towards Mesh, as if trying to grasp a shadow that might slip through his fingers. "Mesh, it's over. We can't bring him back. Please, stop before you destroy yourself." But Mesh didn't respond. His body began to collapse slowly, as if the rage that had fueled him was running out. His eyes were still fixed on the bloodstain beneath him, as if it had become his own mirror. The police, who had been standing in the background, were no longer waiting. One of them grabbed a taser, approaching with heavy steps, then fired the shock. Mesh's body convulsed violently and fell to the ground. The place fell silent suddenly, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was a silence heavy with the unspoken. Jack knelt beside Mesh, holding his shoulder, but he couldn't speak. There were no words. His eyes filled with tears, but he didn't know if he was crying for Mesh, for Sam, or for himself. "It's over. We've lost him," Jack whispered, but his voice reached no one. He was saying it to himself, as if trying to convince himself of something he didn't want to accept. Mesh, lying on the ground, his eyes still open, stared at the ceiling. But he wasn't seeing the ceiling. He was seeing something else, something deeper than anywhere else. He was seeing the void. In that moment, everyone realized that what had happened wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning. A warning of the power of rage when it's unleashed, when it exceeds its natural limits, and when it becomes something greater than life itself. Chapter 19. The Shadow That Never Leaves. The atmosphere was heavier than anyone could bear, as if the air itself shared in the grief. The funeral was silent, but not without screams. Every face was a canvas of pain, every eye an ocean of tears. The coffin draped in the city's flag was not just a symbol of sacrifice. It was a testament to the collapse of something greater, something they hadn't realized the value of until it was too late. Mesh stood away from everyone, not because he wanted to, but because he no longer felt part of the world. He looked at the coffin as if looking at a mirror reflecting everything he had lost. "Forgive me, Sam," he whispered, barely loud enough for himself to hear. But the words were just a futile attempt to fill the void. The void left by Sam's death wasn't a physical one, but an abyss swallowing everything that remained meaningful. Jack, standing beside Anna, seemed like a body without a soul. He had always been the strong one, but today his strength was just a worn-out mask. His eyes sank to the ground as if searching for an answer that could never be found. Anna, trying to stay composed, felt her tears betray her. "How can we go on after this?" The question Jack's eyes asked without words, but there was no need for an answer. The answer was in the silence that enveloped them. The next day, John entered the center. His steps were firm, carrying a promise of chaos. His rough face bore no readable expression. "Things have changed here," he said in a voice that left no room for argument. There was no place for emotions, only facts. And Mesh was a fact that could not be ignored. Jack sat at the desk as John began to speak. The words weren't words, they were judgments. "Mesh is a danger. We can't afford to have him here anymore." Jack, struggling to contain his anger, couldn't stay silent. "He was trying to protect everyone," he shouted, but his voice sounded like someone trying to swim against a powerful current. John didn't flinch. "What we saw in the pharmacy was chaos. We cannot allow that kind of behavior to continue." The words were too heavy to bear, and Anna, listening, finally broke down in tears. Then Mesh entered. His face was weary, his eyes weighed down by an indescribable disappointment. "What's happening here?" he asked in a low voice, though he already knew the answer. Jack, boiling with rage, turned to him and said, "Mesh, you need to leave. We can't go on like this." Jack's words were like a knife. His eyes met Mesh's, but what he saw wasn't anger. It was betrayal. "You're telling me I can no longer stay here?" Jack, trying to stay strong, said in a steely voice, "Yes, that's what I'm saying." Mesh didn't reply. He turned slowly, his steps heavy as if dragging behind him mountains of disappointment. When he closed the door behind him, everyone felt that something had ended. But it wasn't just Mesh's presence in the center that had ended. It was something deeper, something that would never return. In his apartment, Mesh sat amidst the chaos. Everything around him reflected his inner turmoil, but he didn't know that this night would change something. When he entered, he saw familiar faces. Hanzo, strong in both body and spirit, was the first to speak. "My God, Mesh," he said, as if he had found a lost treasure. Yuri, always passionate and lively, jumped to hug him. "I couldn't believe it when they told me you were here." Then came Matteo, always sarcastic but full of love. "Mesh, I can't let the party start without me." It was a small moment, but it carried everything Mesh had lost. "I needed this reunion," he said in a voice filled with longing. On the other side, Jack sat with Anna in silence. The cup of tea before him was a symbol of all that remained unsaid. "I can't stop thinking about Mesh," he finally said. Anna, stronger than she appeared, placed her hand on his shoulder. "The past can't be changed, Jack, but the future is ours to shape." Chapter 20. Closed Circles. The night was cold in the city, as if the chill emanated from within the souls themselves rather than the wind enveloping the streets. The small bar, a place that had always been a refuge for those seeking temporary moments of oblivion, was dimly lit, as if trying to hide everything under the veil of mist creeping in from outside. Mesh entered, his black coat covering him as if to shield the world from him. His steps were quiet, yet they carried a weight he knew would never fade. At the table in the corner sat his friends, Hanzo, the silent, strong one, Yuri, the passionate one, and Matteo, whose voice always carried a sarcastic but affectionate tone. They were there, as if they had been waiting for him for eternity. "You finally came," Matteo said in his usual voice, always tinged with nostalgia and a hint of irony. Mesh smiled faintly, as if trying to piece together what remained of himself. "It's been a long night, but I needed this moment." They sat together, the music rising softly as if insisting on staying in the background. The laughter was scattered, but not entirely innocent. Every word carried an underlying sadness that could not be shed. Yet those moments, however brief, were enough to give them some temporary solace. In the police station, the scene was entirely different. Noise overwhelmed everything. Phones never stopped ringing, officers moved anxiously, and Ryan, the new commander, stood as if he were the only fixed point in this changing world. "Another bag, another message," Ryan said heavily as he looked at the bag's contents. The human organs were arranged carefully, as if each piece told a story, a tale of twisted justice. The ears were the first to catch his attention. The attached note read, "The ears that heard corruption and turned a blind eye have been silenced." "It's the cleric, the one who knew everything but did nothing," one of the officers said in a trembling voice. The next was the punctured heart. "Your heart, which refused mercy, no longer beats." "The hospital director," Jack whispered to himself, as if trying to comprehend how justice could become something like this. And finally, the dried liver. The corrupt liver that drained people's blood is now dry. Ryan, who had been observing everything silently, said, "This is no ordinary killer. He plans everything meticulously. His messages aren't just for the victims, they are for all of us. He wants us to understand that he sees himself as the judge, and his verdict is final." Ned was in his office, surrounded by papers filled with stories of blood and mystery. His eyes were tired, but he couldn't stop. He knew every passing minute brought him one step closer to the truth. But the truth, as he suddenly discovered, was closer than he had imagined. The cold that swept through the room was the first warning. Then came the shadow, then silence. When he tried to move, the strong hand that gripped him told him that it was all over. Getting close to the truth won't help you. That was what he heard before he sank into darkness. Mesh, who had left the bar after the small gathering, walked the city streets as if searching for something unknown. Each step opened windows in his mind to emotions that defied explanation. Jack, Sam, did I choose this path, or did it choose me? The streets were empty, as if leaving him alone with his thoughts. He knew the past couldn't be changed, but he couldn't escape it. Perhaps everything should have ended long ago. Jack, who was at the police station, felt everything collapsing around him. When he decided to call Mesh, he knew the answer wouldn't be easy. But Mesh's cold voice was more than he expected. "You chose your path, Jack, and I chose mine. Don't try to reach out to me again." The words were like bullets, but they weren't new. Jack knew he had lost Mesh a long time ago, but only now did he realize he had lost himself too. Chapter 21. The Canvas of Blood. The city was shrouded in thick darkness, the noise of planes in the sky mingling with the sounds of people in a crowded airport, where Mesh sat in a waiting hall surrounded by his friends. The dim lights barely hid the mist seeping through the large glass windows. Everything seemed charged with the unknown, the future, and hope tinged with anxiety. Hanzo, with his usual calm, sat next to Mesh, while Yuri was busy on her laptop, making final adjustments to an electronic melody. Matteo, with his constant smile, was playing his guitar softly, as if trying to summon an old memory or write a new page. "It's time," Mesh said quietly, looking at the illuminated screen of his phone, then raising it to take a group photo captioned, "To a Better Life." Matteo looked up and laughed lightly. "To a better life? Isn't that a bit exaggerated?" Mesh smiled with hidden bitterness, but replied in a light tone, "Maybe, but we deserve it after everything." Yuri, who had been focused on her laptop, looked up and said, "Finally, a step forward. The new city will be a chance to start fresh. No chaos, no past haunting us." Hanzo chuckled a little, looking at Mesh. "That's what you always said, but it seems real this time." Mesh nodded silently, but felt a hidden burden on his chest. Despite the laughter and light conversations, he knew the past doesn't let go easily. Elsewhere in the city, Anna sat on her couch in her apartment with Jack. Jack held his phone in his hand, staring at the screen silently, as if reading something he couldn't believe. "What's wrong?" Anna asked, noticing the tension in his face. Jack lifted the phone slightly, showing her the short video Mesh had posted. "To a better life." Anna sighed coolly and said, "Finally, he's gone. It should have happened a long time ago." Jack didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the screen as if it were a window to a part of his life he had lost. He was a friend, a brother. "I don't know how all this happened. How did we get to this point?" Anna looked at him sharply and said, "Mesh chose his own path. You tried to save him, but he didn't want help. You need to move on, Jack." But Jack wasn't entirely convinced. "Maybe if I had handled things differently, maybe I could have saved him before it got to this point." Anna placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "Not everyone can be saved. Mesh was heading down this path from the start, and you know that." Jack nodded slightly, but he couldn't shake the feeling of loss. On the other side of the city, when Ned opened his eyes, he found himself bound to a cold chair. The place was dark and abandoned, the air thick with the smell of blood and rust. He tried to move, but the restraints were tight. His body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the fear that began to seep into him like a slow poison. "You finally woke up," the unknown killer said, his voice calm and filled with sadism. Ned, despite his pain and fear, tried to speak. "Who are you? What do you want?" The killer approached him slowly, placing a dagger on Ned's chest, smiling behind his mask. "You were searching for the truth, weren't you? The truth always has a price, and tonight, you'll pay it." Ned's screams echoed in the place, but they were just the beginning. The blood that flowed from his body was just another color added to the devil's canvas the killer was painting. The blood covered the ground. The screams turned into the final notes of a horror symphony as the killer left Ned's lifeless body behind. On the wall behind him, the pentagram and the message written in the victim's blood read, "3 of you are gone now." With a cold smile behind his mask, the killer left the place, leaving behind yet another sign of the chaos that was far from over. Chapter 22. Shadows of Chaos. The city breathed heavily, as if in long labor preceding the birth of an unknown beast. The dim lights in the alleys were not enough to hide the fear that crept into every corner. In one of these corners sat a modest car, wedged between crumbling brick walls like prey awaiting its hunter. Inside the car, John watched the street with the eyes of a hawk. His grip on the steering wheel hinted at pent-up tension, as if the coming moment would swallow everyone. "It's beyond us now," he muttered in a voice barely audible. "The gangs are preparing. I can smell the blood in the air." Paul, beside him, was calmer, but his eyes bore the weight of a man who had seen more than he could handle. "This isn't just a fight, it's a message that they own the city now." He exhaled smoke from his cigarette, watching the shifting shadows on the walls. "But we know what that means. If they move, there won't be a city left to rule." John let out a dry laugh, devoid of any joy. "A revolution? No. This isn't a revolution, it's a mass slaughter. And the city is the victim." Inside the police station, the atmosphere was different, but no less grim. The meeting room looked like an abandoned battlefield, and everyone was a soldier who had lost their commander. On the big screen, the images jumped between gruesome shots of Ned's body, the blood-stained walls, the demonic star drawn as if it were death's signature, and the message, "3 of you are gone now." Anna, who was usually composed, sat as if the weight of the world had been dropped on her shoulders. She whispered, barely able to hear herself, "How could anyone do this? How could a human carry all this cruelty?" Ryan, the new commander, couldn't hide the anger boiling inside him. He stood, his hand trembling slightly, but his voice was like a sword. "This isn't just killing. It's a display. Our killer wants to tell us something, to say that we are powerless. At the other end of the table, Jack was silent, but he wasn't still. His eyes were fixed on the screen, but his mind was elsewhere. He saw Sam's face, remembered every moment with him. Then Ned, and now Mesh, who was cast aside like a fallen leaf in the wind. 3, he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. 3 of us are gone. Suddenly, he turned to Ryan, his eyes filled with a mix of rage and despair. Mesh wouldn't have let this happen. If he were here, he would have stopped this madness. Ryan, trying to maintain control of the room, turned sharply to Jack. Mesh, that traitor. Have you forgotten who he is? We're better off without him. Jack couldn't hold back the anger that erupted like a dormant volcano. Better off? Is that what you think? We are burning now, and we all know he was the only one who could face this. But the conversation didn't last. Ryan ended the meeting firmly, ordering everyone to return home, leaving behind a room filled with heavy silence. Ryan returned home that night, angry and tense. His heavy steps on the stairs reflected a state of inner chaos. But when he entered his home, he felt something different. The air was unnaturally cold, the darkness oppressively thick. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the empty walls. But the echo was the only response. Then, from a dark corner, a tall shadow appeared. It wasn't a person, but something standing there, watching him without moving. "Who are you? What do you want?" Ryan yelled, but his voice was empty, as if speaking to a nightmare. The shadow didn't move, but it made Ryan feel as though the air itself had grown heavy. Suddenly, it took one step forward, then another. Each step was like a war drum's beat. Before he knew what was happening, Ryan found himself held by an iron grip. He tried to resist, but the figure was stronger. No, it wasn't a man. It was something beyond human. There was no time to think. The darkness swallowed the room, and the last thing Ryan saw was a faceless visage with eyes burning like hellfire. Chapter 23. Shadows of Hatred. The room was narrow, but inside it, the shadows of hatred expanded like old spirits inhabiting the corners. Mesh sat on his worn-out chair, his back hunched as if the entire world weighed down upon him. His eyes watched the scattered photos in front of him on the table. Those photos bore familiar faces, faces that had loved him, or so they thought. He picked up a picture of Sam, staring at it silently as though it spoke to him. But his eyes were filled with something more than sorrow. It was a mix of disgust and disdain. He smiled faintly and spoke quietly. "Sam, you saw in me what no one else did, didn't you? Your son, the heir to your ideals?" Ah, Sam, how I hated that word. Son. My boy, like chains you wrapped around my neck. I was never anyone's son, Sam. I was always just a shadow, and shadows don't need a father. He set the picture down gently, but held it like it was a serpent. Then he picked up another picture, a picture of Jack, with his broad smile that seemed to embody the entire world. Mesh smiled too, but his smile held mockery, as if shattering an ancient idol. Jack, the brother, the companion, how noble you thought yourself to be. Always the judge, the righteous one. Smiling at me, but I saw the doubt in your eyes, and the fear. You feared me, didn't you? You knew I was more than what I seemed, and now I laugh because I hated you more than you could imagine. Hated your fake strength, hated your belief in your ability to control. He lit a cigarette, took a deep drag, and then looked at a picture of Anna, who was next to Jack in the photo. Her calm face seemed to reflect tranquility, but to Mesh, it was nothing but a distorted mirror. And Anna, oh, Anna, how you thought you understood me. Thought you saw me for who I really am. You were completely wrong. You were just like the rest of those fools, part of the decor of my fake life. I smiled, gave you what you wanted to hear, But inside, I despised you. Despised that blind trust, which was nothing but a reflection of your stupidity." He paused for a moment, took another deep breath from his cigarette, then looked at the photos again, as if they spoke to him in a language only he understood. He carefully stacked them in a small pile, as if they were sacred items being prepared for a solemn ritual. "Do you all know something? Sam, Jack, Anna. I was never that person you loved. I was just a mask. I played the role you wanted to see. But inside, I hated you all. I smiled, but my heart was screaming with hatred. I looked at you and wondered, how long would it take for you to realize my truth?" He lit his lighter, directed it towards the photos, which began to catch the color of flames. The paper was slowly consumed by fire, and smoke rose in the room, filling the air with the scent of burned memories. Mesh looked at the forming ashes and smiled coldly. "Sam, Jack, Anna, you were my toys. I played with you until I grew bored. Now there's nothing left but ash. And that, my dear friends, is all you ever were to me. Ashes." He took one last drag from his cigarette, then put it out in the pile of ash, like a final punctuation mark. He stood up slowly, gazing at the room engulfed in smoke, then said in a quiet voice, yet carrying an inner storm, "The world, it's a broken mirror. And me, I'm just the shard that blinds anyone who tries to fix it." He opened the door and stepped out. The cold air was waiting for him, but he didn't feel it. Inside, he was colder than any wind. He walked with steady steps, as if leaving his private world to another one that awaited the chaos he would bring. That room, with its fires and burned photographs, was nothing but an internal scene, a metaphor for the ruins of his own self. Behind him, there wasn't just a room, but a forest with intertwined branches, reflecting the chaos that had devoured his soul. Every tree was a witness, every falling leaf like an echo of betrayal or a memory suspended between life and death. The forest wasn't a place, but a metaphor for everything he had lost. When he closed the door, he closed it on everything: memories, promises, even the remnants of humanity that once lived inside him. But the darkness he moved into was not empty. It hid other secrets, tragedies waiting to be revealed. Far from that forest, Ryan lay sprawled on the ground, his body bleeding, his dignity torn. Every movement was met with a groan of pain. Every attempt to rise ended in another defeat. The sound of Mesh's footsteps approached, heavy as hammer blows on an open coffin. Behind him, shadows moved: Yuri, Hanzo, and Mateo. They were like hidden demons, silently following their master, their faces frozen like masks that were never meant to break. When Mesh reached Ryan, he stood in front of him with deadly calm, his eyes like two blazing coals in the midst of the storm. Ryan tried to speak, to express his fear or anger, but the words betrayed him. He barely managed to mutter, "Mesh, damn you." Mesh let out a short laugh, but it was filled with madness. "Damn me? I've long since surpassed curses, Ryan. You just needed more time to realize that." Then suddenly, as if time had collapsed to take them back, the truth appeared. The dim lights shining from Mesh's eyes reshaped scenes from the past. Every crime committed, every bloody message, every cold murder. Mesh had always been there. Not just a killer, but the mastermind, the Lord, and the shadow who planned and watched. All the messages sent to the station were nothing but hidden signatures he left behind. 3 of you are gone. The first was Sam, who fell when he refused to bow to something greater than himself. Then Fayed, who drowned in his curiosity until he was killed. And now, Ryan. Ryan looked at Mesh with wide eyes, filled with terror and shock. Words began to slip from his tongue. You... were the killer all along?" Mesh stepped closer, the dagger in his hand glistening under the moonlight. His eyes blazed with something between anger and disdain. "Yes, it was me. The one you thought was a victim. The one you cast out and broke. But you didn't realize I was always here, watching, planning, recreating the world as I saw fit." Yuri, who stood beside Mesh, added with deadly sarcasm, "It wasn't that hard, was it? All I needed was to be in the shadows." Hanzo stepped forward silently, his tense muscles standing out as if ready to tear the world apart. Matteo, with a cold smile, said, "But the best part is, you were always part of the plan, Ryan. From the very beginning." Ryan screamed at them, his voice a mix of anger and despair. "Why? Why did you do all this? What do you want from me?" Mesh moved slowly, placing the dagger against Ryan's neck, and spoke in a low voice like the whisper of wind. "What I want isn't from you, Ryan. I only wanted to show you all the true face of justice, its ugly face." Then, slowly and horribly, the dagger began to slide across Ryan's skin. Blood flowed heavily, and the sound of screams turned into muffled whispers. Mesh raised the severed head high, turned to his followers with a terrifying smile. "This is his head. We'll send it to Jack as a warning, as a gift." The forest, with its twisted trees and dancing shadows, seemed to celebrate this bloody ritual. But the truth wasn't the forest, nor the blood. The truth was Mesh. Mesh, who was never a victim, but was always the master of the game. Chapter 24, Dance of Shadows. The devil doesn't appear with horns, nor does he carry a torch of fire. The devil speaks quietly with words like honey, yet poisoned. When a person falls into darkness, it is because they have heard those words many times, convincing them that falling isn't the end, but the beginning of a world without restraints or mercy. The first edge, Yuri and the escape from the abyss. Yuri stood on the edge. The wind whipped her face and darkness filled her heart. After being slapped and humiliated by David, the businessman she thought represented her future, life no longer held any value. She looked down at the river beneath the bridge, the dark waters inviting her to jump, to end everything. But a quiet voice coming from nowhere stopped her. "Is this all you're worth, Yuri?" She turned to see Mesh. He stood calmly in the darkness, his features barely visible under the moonlight. His eyes were cold, full of mystery. He approached her but slowly, as if giving her the choice. "Running away isn't the end. It is a sign of weakness. I see something greater in you. You don't realize your strength yet. Come with me. I'll show you a world where there are no weaklings." His words were like magic, penetrating her shattered soul. Hesitantly, she reached out to him. Hours later, she found herself in a dark room amidst strange rituals. Red candles, satanic symbols, and a sharp dagger. Mesh cut her palm, and her blood trickled down, drawing a pentagram on the ground. "This is your first loyalty. Your old life ends here. Now, you will live for immortality and for the unending war." The first prey, David. The following night, David sat in his luxurious office, reviewing files and deals. He received a call from a mysterious woman, inviting him to a profitable deal at an abandoned factory. When he arrived, he found himself trapped between Mesh and Yuri. Mesh approached slowly, his eyes glinting with madness. He grabbed David's right hand and drew his sharp knife. "This hand of yours corrupted so much. Now, it will be a message." With David's screams, Mesh severed his hand, leaving him drenched in his own blood. The next morning, the severed hand arrived at the police station, covered in blood. It was only the beginning of a series of crimes orchestrated by Mesh. Poisoned justice, Matteo. In court, Judge Fard Abdul-Jabbar sentenced Matteo to death. There was no justice, only a corrupt system and hidden interests. In his cell, while waiting for death, Mesh appeared. "You are not a victim, Matteo. You can be stronger than this. Just give me your loyalty." His words were filled with promise and threat. The next day, the evidence that convicted Matteo disappeared, and he was released from prison thanks to Yuri's manipulation of the system. He swore loyalty in a ritual similar to Yuri's. 2 days later, Matteo kidnapped the judge from his home with Mesh's help. In a dark room, the judge was tied to a chair. Mesh, with a cold smile, said, "You sentenced others to death. Now you'll experience the justice of chaos." The judge endured brutal torture, ending with his head being severed. The head was placed in a black box, later sent to Jack as a message. The fall, Hanzo. In an illegal fighting ring, Hanzo, the undefeated giant, was taking heavy blows. The gang leader forced him to drink a poison that made him lose for the first time. After the fight ended, he was left to die in a dark alley. Mesh appeared like the angel of death. "You are stronger than you look now. Give me your loyalty and I'll give you revenge." Hanzo responded, recovering with Mesh's team's help. Days later, they lured the gang leader into a dark room. He endured the bloody eagle torture, where they skinned his tattoos, the symbols of his power. His life ended gruesomely, and his skin was collected in a black box as another message. The climax of the plan, the disappearance. After a series of crimes, Mesh decided to disappear for 3 weeks. In his apartment, he left behind calculated chaos. He destroyed his furniture, tore down his curtains, and broke his favorite guitar. "The war was always waiting for me. Now I vanish to return stronger than ever." Mesh left the apartment, leaving behind the suspicions of the police and everyone else. During his absence, his followers continued executing his plan, spreading the chaos he desired. After the time elapsed, Matteo threw him in front of the police station, his body covered in bruises and superficial wounds. They found him there, appearing as if he had suffered greatly. He was taken to the hospital, while Mesh smiled inside. His plan was proceeding as intended. In the dance of shadows, no one knows who dances and who pulls the strings. Only Mesh knows that war is life, and chaos is immortality. Trust, that word that seems like a quiet salvation, but carries echoes of chaos. It is a comforting illusion planted by the mind in moments of collapse, like a wall we lean on. Without realizing it might collapse on our heads. Deep within, humans have a primal urge for security, and this urge creates trust. But trust is nothing more than a mask worn by fear to appear strong. In a moment of weakness, when pain burdens the soul, one opens the door without caution. The key is given to someone who seems sincere, someone who speaks as if they are a mirror reflecting our shattered selves. We do not ask ourselves then, why does he extend his hand? What does he hide? We just want to believe, want to trust that there is a refuge. But the false sanctuaries are the cruelest. They do not just take what you have, they leave you bare before your own shadow. The faces that receive your trust are not all as they seem. Some wear tight masks, look at you with eyes full of understanding, but their other eyes, hidden from you, weigh you as prey. Whoever opens their heart without looking at who stands before them may find themselves torn apart, not by a knife, but by those soft words that drowned their senses. Trust is tested in unseen spaces, not when things are calm, but when the noise begins. When you find yourself on the edge of an abyss, then you know the one you trusted may be the one pushing you. In that moment, you realize you were not just a victim of someone else, but a victim of your own desire for safety. How many times has trust been offered on a platter of collapse, only to be given as a tribute to power? How many times was the voice you thought was your lifeline actually the rope tightening around your neck? In those moments when illusions crumble, you realize that trust is not a gift, but a weapon, and in the hands of others it may become a dagger. Perhaps the sin is not in trust itself, but in our relentless desire to find someone worthy of it. We carry within our souls an inclination to seek a savior, but the harsh truth is that trust may be a path leading to destruction. It is not always a bridge to salvation. It may be a passage into shadows, shadows that know no mercy. Chapter 25. Masks of Hell. In the depths of the city, where shadows enveloped every corner and choked the truth, good intentions clashed with dark forces that refused to be defeated. The old basement where John and his men gathered felt like the city's final breath, a place filled with dread, yet pulsing with hope. John, with his imposing stature and prematurely grayed hair, stood in the crowd like a beacon piercing through the darkness. His eyes, wearied by time, carried an undying spark. In a voice that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, he said, "This city does not belong to those scoundrels. We do not fight for today, but for tomorrow, for those yet to be born. We must have the courage to die fighting, rather than live in silence." His words pierced hearts like arrows of light, though that light faced a world drowning in deeper darkness. Paul, beside him, added with a voice charged with unwavering passion, "War is not a choice, it is our destiny. If we hesitate tonight, we will be buried tomorrow. Let us be the ones who write the story, not the ones who read it." On the other side of the city, chaos took form, and Ethan was its living embodiment. In an old warehouse, amidst thick smoke and the echoing sounds of gunfire like the call of death, Ethan stood like a silent god in a temple of ruin. His emotionless face concealed a storm of harsh ambitions. He spoke in a calm but authority-laden voice. "Only power creates order. This city does not need the weak. Tonight will not be just a battle. Tonight, we will reshape the world." His words were like incantations calling forth an unending storm. Matteo, his right hand, leaned over a table covered in maps, pointing to where the inferno would begin. "The southern districts first. We will close every road that leads to hope. Everything must fall." Ethan raised his glass of whiskey, his eyes gleaming as though yearning to consume the world. "Power rules, and anyone who dares to stand against us will know what it means to fall." In the police station, the silence was thick, almost a physical manifestation of fear. When the black box arrived, Jack was the first to open it. Inside was Ryan's severed head, their old friend, stained with blood, staring with empty eyes into nothingness. Jack took the attached videotape, his eyes reflecting a mixture of shock and denial. He spoke in a broken voice. "Play it." The video began, showing Mesh, but it wasn't the friend they once knew. He looked as if he had emerged from the depths of hell. His face was painted with demonic black and white symbols, sharp lines telling a story written in the language of blood. His long hair flowed over his shoulders, and his skull-patterned shirt seemed like a silent declaration of war. Mesh smiled with a cold, immeasurable cruelty. He spoke in a calm but madness-tinged voice. "Jack, my friend, did you miss me?" Jack, who had always been a symbol of strength and control, stepped back. "Mesh," he whispered, as if the name had become a haunting specter. Mesh continued, his voice a blend of calm and menace. "You always believed in justice, didn't you? But where was your justice when I burned? Now I am justice. I am the scale. I decide who lives and who dies." Then he lifted Ryan's head before the camera, his blood-soaked hands reflecting something beyond human chaos. He smiled a deadly smile. "This is the fate of the weak. Jack, are you next?" The silence that enveloped the room was heavy, like a harbinger of a storm. Jack stood frozen, every memory of Mesh feeling like a dagger thrust deep into his heart. Beside him, Anna trembled, her tears flowing down her cheeks as if trying to wash away the bitter truth. "This isn't him. Mesh can't be this person," she cried out in a broken voice. But the truth was as clear as the noonday sun. The man they had trusted, the man who had been with them in every moment, was now the embodiment of death. Jack, his voice mixed with anger and despair, said, "Prepare the teams. The war has begun." In another corner of the city, Mesh sat in a dark room lit by a single candle. Around him was his team, Yuri, Matteo, and Hanzo. Each of them represented a piece of his chaos. Mesh took a pen and began to sketch a map of the world he intended to create. He spoke in a calm voice, tinged with madness. "The city is ours now. Jack will not stop, but he doesn't know. He's just a pawn in my game." Yuri, with her sly smile, added, "And what about Anna? Won't it be lovely to see what she's become?" Mesh chuckled shortly and said, "Anna, just pawns. Everyone is a pawn. But I am the king." In the police station, Jack stood before a map of the city, pointing to possible locations where Mesh could be. Behind him, the voices of the officers blended into an indistinct hum. Inside, he was boiling. This wasn't just another criminal. This was Mesh, his friend, his brother, his other half. Jack spoke in a quiet yet seething voice. "Mesh, I don't know why you chose this path, but I swear I will end you, even if it's the last thing I do." In the city's streets, dim lights cast moving shadows, watching the scene in silence. The city was on the verge of exploding, and Mesh knew it. In his heart, he knew Jack wouldn't stop, but he also knew this had been his plan from the start, to turn the hunter into prey. Chapter 26. Manifestation of Chaos. On that night, shrouded in shadows, the city suffocated under an eerie silence, as if holding its breath before erupting into a wave of utter chaos. The mayor's mansion, once a symbol of power and order, had now become the stage for inevitable destruction, where Mesh's plans were about to reach their climax. Mesh led his team, Yuri, Matteo, and Hanzo, towards the mansion. Their steps were steady, and their faces bore no expression except the cold determination to bring ruin. The iron glove Mesh wore on his right hand gleamed under the dim moonlight, as if symbolizing the retribution about to fall upon the city. The mansion stood like a skeletal, abandoned entity, as if waiting for a miracle to restore it, or a curse to end its existence. Mesh advanced with deliberate, measured steps, as though he was reciting his final prayers for this place. Behind him, Hanzo, Matteo, and Yuri followed, dragging their shadows in silence. The iron glove on Mesh's hand shone under the moonlight, like an omen of what was to come. The guards had no idea that death was creeping towards them, its calm steps carrying a silence similar to the moments before the rain falls. Hanzo, without any warning, struck the first guard in his neck. The sound of bones cracking was akin to a funeral melody. The other guard tried to shout, but barely opened his mouth before a knife was plunged into his throat. A deadly calm enveloped the scene, as if nature itself had conspired with chaos. Mesh gave a brief look at the fallen bodies, as if they no longer belonged to this world, and then said, as if delivering a bitter truth, "Blood is merely the ink we write our endings with. The gods, merely footnotes." They entered the mansion, where the employees were engrossed in their work, unaware that their very existence was about to become a fading memory. Matteo moved like a predatory cat, silent until the moment he plunged his knife into the first victim's chest. The man looked at him with wide eyes, filled with a terror that words could not express. "We all search for meaning," Matteo muttered, as if his words were a final solace for the man who collapsed before him. In another corner, Yuri was chasing a young employee. The girl shrank under her desk, her hand over her mouth, trying to hold her breath. Yuri crouched slowly, watching her with the eyes of a hunter who had lost the thrill of the kill long ago, but carried out his duty as an obligation. "No one escapes inevitability," she whispered before delivering her fatal stab. The hallways echoed with the footsteps of the team. Mesh walked with unwavering confidence, as if the world responded to him alone. When he opened the door to the meeting room, 3 employees turned to the source of the noise. One of them opened his mouth to speak, but Matteo was quicker. The first knife pierced his chest, and the second slit his colleague's throat. The third tried to run, but Yuri's hidden bullet shattered his skull, dropping him where he stood. Mesh stood among the bodies, his eyes scanning the room, as if searching for something lost. "Life is nothing more than a series of mistakes, and we are here to correct them," he said quietly, though his calmness dripped with destruction. The mayor's office was at the end of the hallway, its reinforced door standing as though challenging the intruders. Mesh advanced and opened the door slowly. Inside, the mayor sat behind his desk, watching those entering with eyes that held a mix of fear and defiance. "What do you want?" asked the mayor, his voice trembling, though he tried to mask it behind a facade of manufactured strength. Mesh did not respond immediately. He walked towards the desk, then paused for a moment, examining the man before him, as if weighing his existence. "I want the truth," Mesh finally said, his voice calm but filled with something deeper, something like an open abyss. "And the truth is, your existence here is meaningless." He raised the iron glove and struck the mayor's chest with all his might. The sound that followed was like the shattering of massive glass, but it was glass made of flesh and bone. The mayor choked, his blood slowly spreading across the wooden desk, his eyes wide open, as if trying to comprehend the end that had come upon him. "The truth," Mesh said quietly, looking at the corpse. "We will all end up like this moment, a dead piece of flesh, an empty memory." He turned to Yuri, who stood by the door, watching. "Make this place fall silent forever." Yuri, her smile touched with madness, began planting bombs around the room. The small explosives were hidden behind chairs and under tables, like little demons waiting for the command to detonate. "When this mansion falls, they'll think that hell itself borrowed this place," she said with a sly smile. As Mesh watched her work, he walked to a large portrait hanging on the wall. It was a picture of the now deceased mayor. With a cold look, he tore it from the wall and threw it to the floor. "This is how everything ends. No name, no glory, just emptiness." When they finished, the mansion was silent, as if it were dying. But that silence was merely the calm before the storm. Mesh stood in the mayor's office, surrounded by bodies and shattered furniture. He looked at Yuri, who was inspecting the last of the explosives, then approached an old control panel, which was connected to the city's alarm system. He picked up the microphone slowly, as if weighing his words like a killer weighs his blade before striking. He pressed the button, and his voice began to echo in every corner and every street. From the dark alleys to the deserted squares, from the windows of crumbling buildings to wrecked cars, his voice cut through, devouring the silence with something more terrifying. "People," Mesh said in a low but powerful voice, a voice that carried within it the weight of sin. "You have seen your city fall, piece by piece, until it became just a memory of what it once was. Tonight, I will show you its true face. The face you have tried to deny for years." He paused for a moment, as if giving everyone a chance to absorb his words, then continued in a darker tone. "This city was never yours. These streets, these buildings, this life you live, it was all just an illusion you created to hide the truth. And the truth, weaklings, is that power rules, and you do not have it." His breathing quickened as though anger rose within him with every word. "Tonight is not about you. It is about the truth, about purity that comes only through fire and blood. The more you try to escape, the more the truth will hunt you. The more you resist, the more it will crush you. Tonight, the city will burn and be reborn, but not for you. It will be reborn for us, the strong, those who dare face it." His words flowed like cold venom, invading the minds of those listening. "You are nothing but chess pieces, and the game is over. There is no king or queen, only fire that devours everything. And we are the flame that will never be extinguished." He dropped the microphone, and the sound of it hitting the desk was like a signature on his cursed speech. Mesh turned to his team, his face calm but carrying a storm of madness within. "Let's go," he said in a low voice, but it was a command that allowed no argument. He left the mansion with steady steps, carrying the iron glove in his hand like a divine weapon, while the sound of the alarm echoed like the city's last heartbeat. Outside, the square awaited, a place turned into a battlefield of chaos where fire and smoke consumed everything. When he reached the center of the square, Mesh paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the scene as if he were an artist admiring his final masterpiece. He slowly raised his hand, pointing to the chaos around him. "This is what truth looks like," he shouted, his voice filling the sky. "Chaos, blood, and fire. Tonight, the entire city will witness its end and will know that power is the only undeniable force." Then he leapt into the center of the square, ready to make his words a bloody reality. The square was ablaze, fire licking at its edges, smoke rising like a veil concealing the onset of the massacre. From the north, the police advanced under Jack's command, step by step, like an army that knew the battle wasn't in their favor, but had no choice but to fight. From the south, the gangs led by Ethan crawled forward, their faces drawn with hunger-like violence. From the west, the revolutionaries approached, their voices rising with every step, their shouts echoing as though trying to awaken the buried honor of the city. And in the center stood Mesh, a chaotic god smiling at the destruction, flanked by Yuri, Matteo, and Hanzo, his three shadows moving with him as though they were his extended limbs. Bullets began to fly. The police fired with precision, targeting both the gangs and the revolutionaries as if trying to impose order amidst the chaos. The gangs retaliated, advancing ruthlessly, uncaring who stood before them. The revolutionaries fought as though they knew this was their last day, screaming the names of their loved ones, carrying their honor as a final weapon. Amid the chaos, John faced Ethan. The confrontation was inevitable. Two completely opposing characters, one fought for what he believed in, the other for himself alone. Ethan laughed, a maniacal laugh that spoke not of joy, but of absolute cruelty. "Little revolutionary, can't you see it's all meaningless?" Ethan said as he thrust his dagger towards John. John, bleeding from a deep wound in his shoulder, replied in a trembling but strong voice, "Meaninglessness is living without believing in something." In one swift movement, he plunged his dagger into Ethan's heart. Ethan froze, his face holding deep astonishment, and fell lifeless to the ground. But John couldn't stand for long. Ethan's stabs were more than he could bear. He knelt beside him, looking up at the sky, drowning in smoke, and whispered, "Honor is worth dying for." Then he fell, motionless. Paul, who saw his friend fall, ignited in rage. He charged towards the gangs, screaming like a storm, destroying everything in its path. He killed many, but Matteo was waiting. "You are a fierce fighter, revolutionary, but your bravery will not save you now," Matteo said with a cold smile. In a brief skirmish, Matteo managed to slip behind Paul and slit his throat. Paul fell to the ground, still smiling. "Don't retreat. Freedom is worth the blood," were his last words before he closed his eyes forever. At that moment, Mesh was at the peak of his madness. He moved like a whirlwind of blood, killing everyone who approached. The iron glove on his hand glowed as though it held the wrath of the earth itself. The more he killed, the more his smile grew wilder. He made no distinction between enemy and friend. Everyone was a target. Jack was fighting beside Anna, trying to protect her amidst the chaos. But Yuri moved in the shadows, like an assassin who never missed her mark. Suddenly, she appeared out of nowhere and aimed her gun at Anna. One bullet pierced her skull and she fell to the ground. Jack didn't comprehend what had happened for a moment. He knelt beside her, touching her face, but he no longer felt the warmth he knew. "Anna?" "No," he whispered, tears streaming like a river. Jack was drowning in his sorrow, but a revolutionary approached him with a dagger. Before he realized what was happening, Jack felt the sharpness of the blade pierce his side. He turned slowly, seeing the revolutionary's eyes filled with deep sadness. "This is for all who died because of him," said the revolutionary before being shot dead by the police. Jack fell to the ground, his hands trying to stop the bleeding, but he knew the end was near. Everything around him was fading, and all that remained in his mind was Anna's face. Mesh, standing in the center of the square, looked at all he had created. Blood, bodies, fire. It was all a reflection of his madness. He raised his hands high, screaming in a voice that tore through the air. "I am the creator and destroyer. I am the absolute master." He was smiling, knowing that this moment was his ultimate victory. Amidst the rising flames, the individual battles intensified, like a dance of death spinning without end. Matteo, running between the ruins like a stray wolf, faced a revolutionary armed with a knife. With uncanny agility, he dodged the strikes and pounced, gripping the man's head with enough force to shatter it against the ground. "Don't come near me if you want a quiet death," he shouted, his voice echoing like an announcement of the world's end. In another corner, Hanzo faced a group of policemen trying to gain control. His iron grip held his large machine gun, bullets raining down like heavy rain. He left them no chance to hide. "Death is not the end. It is merely the beginning of new chaos," he said, his voice echoing eerily as he looked at the blood staining his clothes like decorations for war. Yuri, positioned at a height, fired her sniper rifle with precision, taking lives with each shot. Her cold face betrayed no emotions, as if she was a piece of death itself, moving silently. "Every bullet brings us closer to true peace. The peace where everyone is buried," she muttered to herself as she pulled the trigger with steady repetition. Mesh isolated one young policeman. The man tried to resist, but Mesh grabbed him easily, as though he were a lifeless puppet. "Do you believe in justice?" he asked in a calm voice, laced with sarcasm. He gave no time for an answer, grabbing the young man's head and kicking with a force that shattered his body like twigs. Mesh continued to rip him apart with his iron glove, as if death itself was being delivered through him. When the chaos paused for a moment, Mesh gathered with Matteo, Hanzo, and Yuri on the mansion's balcony. They looked out over the city, now completely ablaze. Flames devoured buildings, and black smoke covered the sky. Mesh raised his hand, signaling Yuri. She understood immediately and pressed the detonation button. In an instant, the entire square exploded, releasing screams that no one heard, for the flames drowned out every sound. The four stood in silence for a while, watching the scene they had created. After a few moments, Mesh took a deep breath, as if drawing strength from the smoke, and then turned to his followers. He began to speak, his voice sounding as though it came from the depths of hell itself. "Look at what we've created. This isn't war, it's a rebirth. Humans only change through fire, only submit before annihilation. We are not mere instruments of destruction. We are the architects who tear down to rebuild. This city was never theirs. It was a grand lie, and we are here to tear the mask off their faces." What you see before you is not an end, but a beginning of a truth that knows no mercy, acknowledges no lies. His voice blended absolute wisdom with rampant madness as he looked at Hanzo, Matteo, and Yuri. Everything burns because fire is the truth. Humans flee from it, but we embrace it. The more we burn, the closer we get to reality. We are not leaders. We are the demons the world has awaited since the beginning of time. Hanzo looked at him with absolute admiration, knelt on his knees, and said, "Mesh, grant me the greatest honor. Kill me with your own hands." Mesh looked at him with resolve, then said, "You've been loyal, and now you shall get what you deserve." Slowly, Mesh raised his iron glove and delivered a blow that ended Hanzo's life. The large body fell in silence, but his spirit seemed to linger in the air, grateful for the end. Matteo smiled with an indescribable madness. He drew his dagger and plunged it into his own chest, saying, "Death is the only truth, and I accept it with love." He fell to the ground, still smiling, as if he had found the salvation he had sought all his life. Mesh turned to Yuri, who was retreating slowly, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and certainty. "Please, Mesh, I have always been loyal to you." He leaned in slightly, looked at her coldly, and said, "We are all instruments of doom, and you were no exception." He gently took her hand, kissed it, and then ended her life with a swift stab. Amidst the destruction, Jack appeared, crawling, his body covered in blood, his eyes filled with pain and regret. "Mesh," he whispered, but he could not complete his words, collapsing entirely. Mesh paid him no mind, but walked quietly to the edge, where he could see the entire city. He lit a cigarette, gazed at the dark sky, and said in a quiet, solemn voice, "The devil has won." Then he took one last look at the city he had created in chaos and disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a living hell that would never cease consuming everything in its path. And so the story of chaos reaches its peak, not in victory nor in justice, but in a different kind of triumph, where the ashes of what once was stand as the only witness to madness. Mesh fought for a truth he believed to be undeniable, a truth forged in fire, written in blood, and solidified with force. For those who remained, the night swallowed their screams and their hope. The streets, alleys, and squares that once bustled with life were now mere ruins, the price of one man's desire to reshape the world in his distorted image. In the end, Mesh was neither a hero nor a villain. He was a force, an embodiment of what lies in the deepest darkness of human hearts, the yearning for absolute freedom, no matter the cost. But what Mesh did not know, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that even chaos has a price. For every life extinguished, every dream shattered, seeds of resistance were planted deeper in the earth. The world cannot endure without balance, and those who fell tonight may have perished, but their spirits would become part of the city's foundation. The dying's silent vow, the belief in justice, in a better tomorrow, did not vanish with their bodies. No, it would remain, waiting, growing, until another day comes when someone else rises from the rubble to face the darkness. The end of the city was horrific, with citizens turning into murderers, even children not spared from this terrible fate. The remaining forces of justice were scattered, and the city was utterly destroyed, appearing as nothing more than a war-torn battlefield filled with death and pain. The police lost control, and everything turned into nothingness due to Mesh's game. Like the butterfly effect, every step Mesh took, every life he claimed, had repercussions that extended endlessly. He caused the destruction of the city by killing 12 key figures, each of whom represented a part of the system that kept the city intact. With their fall, the balance collapsed and chaos erupted, consuming both the great and the small without mercy. Chaos was nothing more than the result of a series of seemingly individual decisions, but they were enough to change the fate of an entire city. In the end, Mesh was a manifestation of absurdity, a warrior against the void of life. But in his own way, he drowned in the chaos that offered him no answers. Mesh was a reflection of humanity, trapped in his fate, a character fleeing from one cage to another, lost between the walls of his power and his helplessness. He was an example of someone trying to tear down the walls around him, only to discover that the walls were part of his very being. Chaos was merely a mirror reflecting our primal truth, our need to be masters, even if only over the ruins of the world. And what of the devil who stood tall upon the mountain of destruction he had created with his own hands? Mesh disappeared into the darkness, believing he had won. But victory, true victory, is not merely the absence of resistance or the silencing of all voices. It is peace, a far more elusive and powerful concept, something Mesh never sought and never achieved. The city will remember not the fire or the death, but the quiet moments between the chaos, the sacrifices made, the words spoken by those who believed in something greater than themselves. And one day the city will breathe again, not because of Mesh, but in spite of him. Because as long as there are those who have the courage to fight for tomorrow, chaos will never be the final answer. The battle may have been lost, and the devil may have had the last laugh, but in the hearts of those who remained, there was still a glimmer of light. It was faint, but it was enough. Because this is not the end. This is where the story begins anew. A story not of the destruction he left behind, but of the courage born from it. A story of people who dare to rise from the ashes, unbowed, undeterred, ready to rebuild what chaos tried to claim forever. But who is Mesh, truly? And what drove him down this dark path? From the moment Mesh opened his eyes to this world, life seemed to him like an endless thorny field. The house he grew up in was nothing but a maze of cold walls, where cruelty was the only understood language. His father, a man who carried the weight of the world in his heart, expressed his frustrations through silent, merciless blows. Every day, Mesh returned to that prison, expecting inevitable consequences, whether he made a mistake or not. Life in his home was like an absurd play, where everyone played predetermined roles. His father, the tyrant, saw strength as the only value, and weakness as an unforgivable sin. He would lash out at him with criticism and beatings for the slightest reason. Perhaps because Mesh's eyes reflected a sadness he couldn't hide, or because his steps did not match the rhythm of prevailing anger. His father said in a cold, hate-filled voice, "You are a curse on this house. You have no value here. Strength is everything, and you have none of it." Those words echoed in Mesh's mind endlessly, always reminding him of his fragile place in this world. He felt his soul gradually melting away, as if his existence was dissolving into an endless void. Yet the pain was not his alone. One night, shrouded in darkness, his father returned home drunk, his eyes blazing with unquenchable fire. He turned toward his little sister, that innocent soul who knew so little of life, and began to unleash his violence upon her. He screamed, his voice filling the house. "You and your brother are the reason for all my misery. You don't deserve to live." Mesh stood frozen, watching that nightmarish scene unfold once more. His sister's screams tore through the silence, his hands trembling between fear and helplessness. In that moment, he felt that the world had completely collapsed and that silence was no longer an option. Without full awareness, he rushed to the kitchen and grabbed a knife. He didn't know what this act would lead to, but he felt it was time to put an end to this ongoing torment. With heavy steps, he approached his father, who was lost in his frenzy. Without hesitation, he plunged the knife into his back. His father turned towards him, his eyes filled with shock. But words found no way between them. The body fell to the ground, blood mixing with the cold floor of the house. Mesh stood watching the scene, a strange feeling of emptiness filling his being. He felt neither guilt nor relief. Only a deep silence enveloped the place. But even after this act, he did not find the peace he was searching for. The torment he had lived with for years did not dissipate. He realized that killing was not salvation, but perhaps the beginning of a deeper descent. In a desperate attempt to escape the spiral of pain, he decided to end it all. He climbed to his room, closed the door behind him. He tied an old rope to the ceiling, stood on a wobbly chair, and tied the rope around his neck. He whispered to himself in a faint voice, "Maybe in nothingness, I will find what I couldn't find in existence." He pushed the chair away with his foot and fell into a dark void. But instead of an ending, he found himself drowning in a sea of shadows where there was neither time nor place. There, in the depths of that void, a mysterious entity appeared to him, its features unclear, its eyes glowing with a cold gleam. He heard a voice echoing in his mind, a voice unlike any human sound. "Did you think death was salvation? Escape is an illusion, and suffering is the only truth." Mesh felt the weight of those words like chains binding him. He muttered in a trembling voice, "I just wanted to escape the pain, the endless injustice." The voice responded with chilling calm, "There is no escape from the whirlpool of existence. Pain is a part of you, and escaping it is escaping yourself. But there is another choice. Embrace chaos and free yourself from the shackles of weakness." In that moment, he felt a cold current sweeping through his body, as if something had changed inside him. He opened his eyes to find himself on the floor of his room, the rope cut, the darkness dispelled. But he was no longer the same person. There was a deeper void, a coldness consuming his emotions. He went out into the streets, wandering aimlessly, a stranger in a world that did not understand him. People around him went about their lives, unaware of the storm brewing inside him. He reached an abandoned neighborhood and sat on a worn-out wooden bench, watching the distant horizon. He saw a group of children playing, their laughter filling the place with life. His gaze rested on one of them, Jack, whose eyes sparkled with enthusiasm and challenge. Their eyes met for a moment. And from here, the story of the demon Mesh began. Dear reader, perhaps you have wondered about the secrets behind stories, about those words that flow from someone's pen, carrying a part of their soul. This is not just a story for entertainment. It is a journey into the depths of a human being searching for meaning in a world filled with chaos and unanswerable questions. It is a quiet cry, an attempt to understand oneself when the mind finds no one to share the burden. As you read these words, you might find that the struggles and thoughts you are going through resonate here, between the lines of these pages. In the quiet hospital room, the sound of the machines pulsed with a steady rhythm. An 18-year-old sat on a white bed, holding an old notebook. His hair was thin, and his eyes bore the marks of battles no one else had seen. He picked up the pen and wrote the final sentence. The story of the demon Mesh began. He closed the notebook and smiled faintly. He whispered to himself, "I have poured everything inside me into these pages." The story he wrote was not just words on paper. It was a reflection of his tormented soul, his inner struggles, and the continuous search for meaning in a seemingly meaningless world. The characters were merely parts of him, representing different aspects of his being. Mesh wondered in a low voice, "Will someone find something helpful in my story? Will my message reach those who need it?" He looked out the window at the pale sky and closed his eyes. Perhaps he hadn't found all the answers, but expressing himself was a step toward a deeper understanding of his existence. He rested his head on the pillow and left the notebook beside him. In that silence, there was a mysterious peace that enveloped the room, a peace resembling an ending that arrives without announcement or explanation. Perhaps his story had ended, and perhaps the steady sound of the machines now held a different rhythm, one that only Mesh could hear. The journey of the self had not ceased, but it was no longer being told, as if the truth had been lost in the folds of silence and everything remained unanswered, closing the door to those seeking knowledge, leaving behind a void filled only by mystery.